In a moment, in accordance with House rules and regulations, the host will mute all participants other than Chairman Engel.
The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously circulated address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and others physically present in this room, per guidance from the Office of Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's proceedings, except when a member or witness is speaking. Please also sanitize your seating area. The Chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. For members participating remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they aren't under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. The committee meets this morning to examine American international broadcasting efforts under the U.S. Agency for Global Media. For weeks, we expected the opportunity to hear from and question USAGM's new CEO, Mr. Michael Pack. Mr. Pack's brief tenure has been a rocky and controversial one. He immediately removed Voice of America's leadership, as well as the presidents and boards of Radio Free, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and the Middle East Broadcasting Network. Removing the experienced boards from the services, he replaced them with new boards consisting of himself, his chief of staff, a number of Trump administration political appointees, and the senior counsel of an organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has designated an anti-LGBT hate group. He tried to fire the acting CEO and board of the Open Technology Fund, but a court reversed his decision. He removed the standards editor from Voice of America, the watchdog, who makes sure VOA's content meets all the benchmarks of independent journalism. He declined to renew the visas for Voice of America journalists who came to the United States to produce unbiased news and information. I want to emphasize this. The U.S. government asked these people to come work for us because of their expertise and language skills, to send news back to countries where press freedoms are often threatened. Now some of these people are being forced to leave the country. It's shocking that the United States government would treat any journalist that way, let alone one we've asked to do the job. Mr. Pack cut off funding for the Open Technologies Fund, or OTF, funding that Congress had approved. To remind everyone of what OTF does, They support development of circumvention and communication tools so that journalists and citizens are better able to share news and information in countries where governments try to censor and stifle those things. We're talking about places like Belarus, Iran, China, and Venezuela. And he has suspended a number of senior USAGM officials in what I believe to be a retaliatory and improper action. 3 months ago, I invited Mr. Pak to appear before this committee to answer our questions and explain his alarming first few weeks on the job. On August 3rd, his office made a commitment to appear here today. Let me repeat that. On August 3rd, his office made a commitment to appear here today. A week ago, shortly after the committee noticed this hearing, his office called back to tell us he was breaking his commitment. That's breaking his commitment. USAGM refused to provide specific reasons, stating only that there were, quote, administrative proceedings, unquote, that required Mr. Pak's attention. The committee has since learned that Mr. Pak personally, personally scheduled for today an administrative hearing for those people he suspended. He notified those individuals last Thursday, the same day USAGM told the committee he was backing out of this hearing. My understanding is that under USAGM regulations and standard federal agency practice, the head of agency shouldn't even be involved in such administrative hearings, that they should be left to the security professionals. USAGM proposed other dates in October when the House is in recess. It's my view that Mr. Pak manufactured this conflict to get out of being here today. So the committee issued a subpoena to compel his testimony. With the chair at the witness table empty, Mr. Pak is now in defiance of that subpoena. Our international broadcasting efforts are a critical foreign policy tool. USAGM's constituent services provide high-quality, independent news and information in some of the most closed-off places in the world. The best way to push back on the propaganda coming out of Russia, China, and elsewhere is to provide the truth plain and simple. We need competent leadership at the helm of those efforts. We need someone who understands journalism and respects journalists. We need someone who understands that the head of a federal agency is accountable and that Congress has a constitutional right to conduct oversight. We need someone who respects the law and allows our broadcasters to operate free from interference. Mr. Pak has made clear in his short tenure that he meets none of those qualifications. He is making a mockery of a U.S. agency that has long enjoyed strong bipartisan support. And he has shown tremendous disrespect for the committee, our committee, and its role overseeing USAGM. He's the wrong person for the job. He should resign, and if he doesn't, the President should fire him. Since Mr. Pak won't talk to us, we'll instead hear from some of those he's pushed out or tried to push out, competent public servants and journalists who, because they were committed to doing their jobs well, had no place in Mr. Pak's USAGM. I'll now yield to the ranking member for any opening comments he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank to each of the witnesses who are appearing before us here today. The U.S. Agency for Global Media's mission is to further press and internet freedom around the world. Recently, I and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have grown very concerned the agency's mission is being undermined from the top. Most problematic to me has been what I can only characterize as the impoundment of funds meant for the Open Technology Fund. OTF was stood up as an independent grantee last year in a bipartisan manner by Congress. Yet despite a track record of success in providing internet access and other vital support to those in China, Iran, Russia, and other authoritarian states, CEO Pak has ignored the will of Congress and withheld millions of dollars in funding from OTF. This is not a typical DC policy discussion. I believe his actions damaged support during the height of unrest in Hong Kong. and they are continuing to do so today in Belarus. Their tragic lack of support to freedom and democracy movements is also regrettable because, in my judgment, it directly undermines key priorities of this administration that I have discussed at the very top levels. And that, unfortunately, isn't the only concerning action. In sum, U.S. AGM has not been responsive to Congress in many cases. We have asked the agency for their strategic response to the situation in Belarus, but have received no response. Our office inquired about the return of Radio Free Europe to Hungary, but received no response. Also, after most of the front office was placed on administrative leave, we simply asked for the names of those people who are heading the key offices at U.S. AGM, but like so many of our other questions, this too was met with silence. We are a separate and equal branch of government. And Mr. Chairman, this committee deserves the respect of a response. Make no mistake, I believe there's some reform that needs to be done at U.S. AGM, and that should take place. And any questionable content, such as the video which aired on Voice of America that seemingly appeared to endorse Vice President Biden, that should also be thoroughly investigated. There is no place for this type of politics inside the U.S. AGM. But I don't think we should throw out the baby out with the bathwater here. And I ask today once again for CEO Pack to release the funding approved by Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution and release the funding that was approved by Congress for OTF and to meaningfully engage with Congress to provide answers to the basic questions we must ask as part of our oversight duties. Unfortunately, as Mr. Pack has decided not to attend today's hearings, despite a subpoena from this committee and from Congress, I hope that today's witnesses can provide us with details about what is going on at the U.S. AGM in his absence. I believe that, Mr. Chairman, this technology is so important in countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to communicate within the country, inside and outside, and people in the country to communicate amongst themselves so that they can be in a position to yield back from their oppressors. Without this important tool that Congress has authorized and funded, we will have a very difficult time in this mission for greater democracy and freedom throughout the world. And with that, I yield back.
I thank my friend, the ranking member, and pursuant to notice, the committee is convened today to conduct oversight of the U.S. Agency for Global Media and U.S. international broadcasting efforts. As Mr. Pack has decided to defy the committee's duly authorized subpoena, we will reset the witness table for our second panel. Our witnesses today.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Series.
I have a question. Why don't we leave the empty chair with his name on there to show the people that he just blew our subpoena of Mr. Pack?
That's fine with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Series. Our witnesses today have played a variety of roles at U.S. AGM over the years and bring a wealth of experience on our international broadcasting efforts. Their backgrounds range from diplomacy to journalism to policy to government administration. What they have in common is that Mr. Pack pushed them all out of their roles at U.S. AGM, or tried to. In my view, you've all served admirably and should be thanked for your hard work advancing U.S. AGM's important mission. Ambassador Karen Kornblue is chair of the Board of Directors of the Open Technology Fund. She also served on the boards of the other services until Mr. Pak removed her, and on the Board of Governors. She also served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development during the Obama administration. Ambassador Ryan Crocker also sits on the board of the Open Technology Fund and was previously a member of the other service boards. At the State Department, Ambassador Crocker was one of our most distinguished career diplomats, serving as United States Ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. I'd say that's in the middle of the fight. Ms. Amanda Bennett is the former director of the Voice of America, where she served from 2016 until June of this year. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who previously worked at Bloomberg News, the Lexington Herald-Leader, the Oregonian, and the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Jamie Fly is the former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and is now a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president at the German Marshall Fund. He previously worked as a counselor for foreign and national security affairs for Senator Rubio and served on the National Security Council staff during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Grant Turner is the Chief Financial Officer of the United States Agency for Global Media and also served as the interim CEO of the agency from fall of last year until June. He previously served as Budget Director for the Millennium Challenge Corporation and at the Office of Management and Budget during the Bush and Obama administrations. Excuse me. Without objection, your complete written testimony will be made part of the record of this hearing, and I'll recognize you for 5 minutes each to summarize your testimony. Mr. Turner, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee. I'm testifying today to disclose significant concerns about the U.S. Agency for Global Media, specifically related to the dire events that have been unfolding at the agency over the past few months. First, though, let me start by telling you a little bit about myself and USAGM. I've been privileged to serve in the U.S. Federal Civil Service as a career employee for 17 years, most of the last 4 at this agency. My tenure spanned multiple presidential administrations. I began working for the federal government with GAO, and then I worked for OMB for 6 years, 3 under President Bush and 3 under President Obama. I've served as the budget director for the MCC and also for the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a lot of experience in government operations, but nothing in my 17 years comes even close to the gross mismanagement, the abuse of authority, the violations of law that have occurred since Michael Pak assumed the role of CEO at USAGM in June of this year. Until I was abruptly removed by Mr. Pak in mid-August, I served as the agency's chief financial officer. For the 9 months preceding that, I was the acting CEO. Based on my many interactions with this committee and your staffs on a bipartisan basis, I know you care very much about our mission to bring truthful news and information to our audiences overseas, and I truly thank you for that years-long partnership. Today, USAGM networks broadcast in 61 languages to over 100 countries worldwide, reaching 350 million viewers, listeners, and readers weekly. Our networks include the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and our newest grantee, the Open Technology Fund. They're truly a gift from the American people to the world. We sometimes forget, living in our very rich media environment, that much of the world is quite underserved. As one of my colleagues on this hearing today, Amanda Bennett, is fond of saying, our organization exports the First Amendment. It's part of the foundation of our nation's success. So I'm very proud to be associated with the 4,000 employees that do the work at USAGM. It's a privilege to be associated with the journalists, the editors, the production specialists, technology experts, and support staff. They're very passionate about what they do. During the past 4 years, the agency has made notable and important progress especially thanks to the input and support of this committee. So thank you. We've modernized the platforms that we broadcast on, moving as media markets evolve and going to where our audiences want us to be, from radio to TV to social media. A testament to how well the agency has performed in the last several years is borne out by numerous metrics. For instance, between the beginning of FY 2016 and now, our global weekly audience has grown from 226 million people per week to 350 million people per week, a 55% increase. It's a good example that we're responding effectively to fast-moving media markets, and it's a tangible demonstration that people across the globe crave the truth. Our colleagues are journalists. The agency doesn't do propaganda. Our charters mandate that editorial decisions are made without outside influence. They're protected by what we call a firewall. And a firewall is much more than an abstract concept. It's the law, and it's been the law for over 3 decades. Our audiences live in places that are awash in government spin, propaganda, and misinformation, or countries where there simply isn't any press, and we fill that vacuum with journalism that aims to be the best in class. Unfortunately, I've worried about what Mr. Pak has done since his arrival. Like many of you, I'm worried about the credibility and the goodwill of our networks being destroyed. It's taken literally decades to build this trust with our audience, and tragically, it can be destroyed far more quickly. That's what I fear is happening now. I'm worried about our failure to support important technology tools developed by the Open Technology Fund. OTF funds internet firewall circumvention tools used by our audiences in Iran and China and Russia and other closed societies to freely access the internet and our content. Within days of Mr. Pak's arrival, he declared war on OTF. First, he started by firing its leadership, then he choked off its funding. At one point, after learning from OTF that we might lose important tools, I sent an urgent email to Mr. Pak's team, essentially pleading for permission to release funds to OTF, and I highlighted what was at stake. For instance, in the case of Iran, we risked losing 84% of the audience if we didn't fund OTF's tools. To put this in context, we're the #1 international broadcaster in Iran. Many people don't know this. We have nearly 25% of Iranian adults tuning in to our coverage each week. Voice of America and Radio Free Europe's Radio Farda brand are the #1 TV and radio broadcasters there. Here is a country where we worry about a war breaking out, where the Iranian people are fed a steady diet of misinformation and half-truths about America, but every night, a quarter million of Iranian adults tune into USAGM. From the VOA studios that are just 2 blocks from this room to the living rooms of the Iranian people, we bring unfiltered, truthful news about America, our policies, and our country's values. That's tremendous soft power, and it's unfortunately at grave risk right now. OTF isn't the only example. In the 2.5 months I worked under Mr. Pak, he repeatedly breached the firewall designed to protect journalists and editors from political influence. Months ago, he removed standards editor Steve Springer from Voice of America. He removed the executive editor from Radio Free Asia, Bei Fang, who's the person that leads our overall China strategy at that network. It was Mr. Pak who simultaneously fired the presidents of all of our networks, including Jamie Fly, who is testifying here today. Those actions and many others led the Senate appropriators to put a hold on some of our funding. Mr. Pak chose to ignore that hold that they placed on our funding. To be clear, Mr. Pak's failures to act in many areas are of concern of me, the folks who are testifying today, and the employees of USAGM, and I think all of you. To close my remarks, I'd just like to quickly mention a few other things, irresponsible acts of financial mismanagement that have taken hold under Mr. Pak. For example, I found myself frequently fielding calls from the leadership of our grantee networks who were being starved of resources because Mr. Pak's team wouldn't disperse funds on a timely basis. Both Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia contacted me to say if they didn't receive funds soon, they wouldn't be able to meet payroll. This is no way to run a railroad. Mr. Pak's team refused to approve a simple cleaning contract for our Kuwait shortwave facility in the middle of a pandemic. They refused for weeks to approve a contract to order toilet paper for our Thailand transmitting facility. This had nothing to do with shortages of toilet paper during the pandemic. We had sources identified. Mr. Pak's team just didn't want to approve the order for weeks. I don't know why. So staff just brought in their own toilet paper from home. That unusual problem still existed when I left the agency. Maybe it is still the case today. Based on what I've witnessed, from small issues to very big ones, I don't believe Mr. Pak and his team came to run the agency. I don't think they even like it. This just isn't what normal people do. It isn't what normal management looks like, certainly not in the world I come from, and probably not in yours either. I fear their mismanagement will continue to erode the performance of the agency, and with any misstep, they'll just use that to fire more people and continue diminishing the agency. So to close, we need your help. You'll hear from excellent people today. Please continue to practice the kind of strong oversight that you're doing. It's truly helpful, and it may stop or at least slow the abuses that you're hearing about. USAGM is a very valuable agency to help create the kind of world that most Americans want to live in. I look forward to answering any of your questions later in the hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that testimony. Very important. We appreciate it. Ambassador Kornblue.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee for holding this hearing and for receiving my testimony. I'm privileged to serve as chair of the board of the chair of the board of the directors of the Open Technology Fund, and I'm here today representing that bipartisan expert board. I've worked at the intersection of democracy, technology, and independent media for many years, currently at the German Marshall Fund. Previously, I served, as you mentioned, as U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, where I negotiated on behalf of the U.S. the first global internet policymaking principles. You've invited me here today to discuss the challenges posed by USGM's new leadership to the Open Technology Fund, and thereby to America's internet freedom efforts abroad. OTF is a bipartisan American success story. It is absolutely critical to U.S. efforts to combat the rise of digital authoritarianism. But unfortunately, the agency has defunded and is now disparaging this small but crucial organization, undermining both USAGM's mission and the cause of internet freedom at a time when they're needed most. As you know, the internet is a vital information lifeline for billions worldwide, including USAGM's audience of over 345 million people. Authoritarians increasingly strive to sever this lifeline. Over 2/3 of the world's population live in a country where the internet is censored. OTF was created precisely to respond to this threat, and has done so through a considered multi-pronged approach. OTF has directly funded more than 100 internet freedom technologies used by over 2 billion people globally, including both circumvention tools, such as those that enable tens of millions of users in China and Iran to avoid censorship, and secure anti-surveillance technologies, such as those relied on by journalists and democracy activists in Hong Kong and Belarus. In addition, OTF has fostered a global community of technologists, digital security experts, journalists, and human rights defenders advancing internet freedom. By connecting these groups and individuals, OTF has helped to grow the community to thousands around the world. Research efforts funded by OTF have also been essential to exposing aggressive new threats in places like Xinjiang and developing next-generation solutions, including, for example, AI-powered circumvention techniques. OTF has funded security audits that have exposed and patched over 2,000 vulnerabilities and supported the translation of internet freedom technologies into more than 200 languages. Through this rich multi-pronged strategy, OTF has not only supported the development of the world's leading technologies, but has also empowered millions of people living in censored countries to access USAGM content and other sources of independent news and information online. Both Congress and the U.S. Department of State have recognized that OTF has become a critical bulwark against rising digital authoritarianism. Yet, in June, Mr. Pak attempted to fire OTF's expert leadership and remove its independent bipartisan board of directors. Those moves were thankfully blocked by a unanimous decision of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. In addition, USAGM representatives have leveled a variety of accusations the organization has repeatedly refuted, providing over 200 pages of information and documentation and offering numerous times to undergo additional independent financial audits. We've offered a GAO assessment and/or an OIG investigation, but USAGM has refused, making it clear that the goal is not to resolve evidence-based concerns, but rather to discredit OTF. More devastating, the agency continues to withhold nearly $20 million in congressionally allocated funds, forcing OTF to halt 49 out of its 60, or 80%, of its ongoing internet freedom programs. This has meant leaving journalists, human rights defenders, and activists around the world without the tools they need. In just 4 months, the world's leading funder of internet freedom technologies, OTF, has been dismantled, and U.S. internet freedom and democracy efforts around the globe have been crippled. Authoritarian regimes have made it abundantly clear that they are willing to do and spend what it takes to extend their control over the internet. From Xinjiang to Taiwan to Minsk, repressive regimes are deploying a new generation of advanced technology designed to stifle dissent, track minorities, and manipulate content online. And while these were once the tactics of a few rogue regimes, they are now a global threat, with governments around the world investing billions of dollars in the latest censorship and surveillance systems each year. The United States has and should continue to confront these threats head-on in an effort to preserve the internet as democratic space for free expression. Instead, the recent actions have undermined critical U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities and imperiled the lives of millions of journalists, activists, and human rights defenders by leaving them vulnerable around the world. For the United States government to maintain its role as a global leader on internet freedom at this critical moment in history, it is urgent that it restore OTF's funding and recommit to its important work. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We now go to Ms. Bennett.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, committee members, thank you. I'm Amanda Bennett, the former director of Voice of America, and I have had the privilege of interacting with many of you on this committee on both sides of the aisle. I've found you sometimes critical, sometimes complimentary, but always supportive and understanding of our mission. I am here because I care deeply about our country's institutions, most importantly, the institution of the free press and our First Amendment. As a result of this, I've come to care deeply about VOA and its missions, which embody those values around the world. Although unlike some others here, I have not been involved in USAGM since my departure, I welcome the opportunity to use my expertise and experience to talk about the factor that I think is most important to the success of VOA and USAGM, which is the legislative firewall that protects the journalist's independence. And while I speak of VOA, the institution for which I'm most familiar, everything I say applies equally to USAGM and the rest of the entities. They operate under exactly the same legislation and practices and customs. I believe my journalistic career sets me up perfectly to talk about this legislative separation. My career spans nearly 50 years, all but the previous 4 in private industry. beginning as a student at Harvard Crimson. I then spent 23 years at the Wall Street Journal, where I was their second Beijing correspondent. I've held senior positions, including top editor positions at 4 other leading news organizations. I'm a 2-time Pulitzer Prize recipient, and I've served for nearly a decade on the board that awards those prizes. Therefore, I think I can say that I have wide experience which the legislation regarding the U.S. Agency for Global Media calls the highest standards of professional journalism. VOA is America's largest international broadcaster, 100% government funded, but by law, operationally independent. VOA distributes news and information by radio, television, and digital in 47 languages to over 60 countries. In most of VOA's markets, VOA is the only source of critical news. Journalism is at the heart of USAGM's mission, with the word journalism embedded for decades throughout the governing laws and regulations. Unlike other government messaging operations, we don't message, we provide useful, credible, and independent news and information. The single most important factor in that effectiveness is the editorial separation between news and any outside interference. This separation is known informally as the firewall and is made up of over decades with laws, regulations, and common practices. The very fact that our news is provided outside the control of any party in power gives VOA its own power, and audiences around the world see and appreciate the credible information VOA provides. Around the world in the markets that VOA surveys, it enjoys 60 to 80% credibility ratings, even as Mr. Turner remarked, even in countries like Iran that are considered hostile to America. And this legal separation is the single most important thing that distinguishes government-funded independent news from the propaganda that many of our authoritarian regimes that we covered practice. Under the protection of the firewall, VOA over the previous 4 years refocused on its mission as the free press to the world. It refocused on its charter mandate to represent all and not just some Americans. It increased resources devoted not just to Washington, but to the center of the country. In telling America's story, VOA reported proudly on the things that America excels at and that much of the world wants to know about: technology, entrepreneurship, medical advances, and research, education, and philanthropy, while at the same time reporting unflinchingly on failings like school shootings and racial tension. We also provided panels of global medical experts on COVID-19, giving information much needed in places that had no other access to it. Combating bias in journalism is a critical task, and especially so in today's polarized environment. VOA made bias training mandatory, and through regular communication made eliminating bias a priority. VOA was tough on ethics violations, on internal corruption, and on inappropriate use of social media. VOA's leaders were transparent and forthcoming in these matters, and outsiders knew of these actions immediately because VOA disclosed them immediately. In addition, VOA extended its original mission of bringing news and information to those most isolated by launching broadcasting into refugee camps and dramatically increasing focus on women in the world. The team also moved VOA decisively into the digital space, where its audience's attention was rapidly moving. One success in particular bears noting. Morale, for which the agency had been rightfully criticized, rose steadily during those 4 years, with overall employee satisfaction jumping from 47% in 2016 to over 70% in 2020, using a survey that replicated the usual methods and questions. This is proof that the power of the mission works. Morale improves when you treat people with respect, support a mission with a high and inspirational purpose, set high ethical standards, and enforce them rigorously but fairly. People want the organization to perform in the way it's intended to perform and to accomplish the mission it is tasked with accomplishing. I want nothing but success for VOA, all of the entities, and USAGM. When the organization runs smoothly under the protection of this firewall and operates proudly regardless of whatever party is in charge of the government, as has been the case for decades, it will be yet another testament to the strength and power of the institution and of the free press. I encourage everyone to please respect and strengthen, if possible, the firewall that makes this all possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bennett. We now go to Mr. Fly.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, other members of the committee, I want to thank you for holding this hearing and inviting me to testify today. I'm going to briefly summarize my written testimony. I first want to associate myself with the testimony of my colleagues. We all had different vantage points during our time working together at USAGM, but I share the concerns they have expressed, especially about the editorial independence of the networks and the brave journalists that work at all of our networks. Until June of this year, I was honored to serve as president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which, as we've discussed, is a congressionally funded broadcaster reaching 38 million people across 23 countries in 27 languages. It's often referred to as RFERL, which I'll stick to make this go faster. RFERL and the other private entities that receive grants from USAGM provide objective news and information to audiences around the world and help citizens hold governments accountable for their actions. You've heard a bit about my background. I've worked my entire career in national security and foreign policy. I've served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, on the National Security Council staff of President George W. Bush. I was Marco Rubio's foreign policy advisor for 4 years in the US Senate and also advised him during the 2016 presidential campaign on foreign policy. In July 2019, the bipartisan USAGM board selected me to be RFERL's president and CEO for a period of 3 years. I was drawn to this work at RFERL because I believe that given the centrality of information in our modern societies, it's more important than ever to the fate of democracies that we modernize the tools that helped win the Cold War for this new digital age. As you know, RFERL was key to that Cold War success. While I was president of RFERL, I worked to make the network more effective in addressing current and future challenges. When I arrived at the organization last summer, I found that constant leadership turnover had caused significant chaos and drift. Funding gaps were widespread. A roughly flat budget was increasingly allowing competitors to hire away staff and putting the network at a disadvantage in key markets. Russia, which is our most significant competition across Eurasia, but also others, were outspending RFERL by several orders of magnitude. Morale across the organization was low. My team and I began quickly to try to make improvements that were fully supported by the organization's bipartisan corporate board at the time, which I should note included a representative of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. These changes were supported by USAGM leadership, and I briefed these changes to members of Congress and their staff, including some of you on this committee. After just 10 months as president, and despite a once-in-a-century pandemic that significantly impacted our operations, we were making real progress. We increased RFERL's focus on digital platforms, which experienced significant audience growth during the pandemic. We expanded investigative reporting and prioritized journalistic professionalism and training. We increased coverage of China's growing influence across Eurasia, and we developed new tools to combat disinformation. As I left, we were developing strategies to expand our audience inside Russia, despite coming under significant pressure from the Kremlin. I also oversaw the preparations for RFERL's return to Hungary, which culminated 2 weeks ago in the launch of RFERL's new digital Hungarian service. Finally, we worked to improve RFERL's security and countered attempts by foreign governments to threaten or pressure our employees. All of this work unexpectedly ended in mid-June, days after the Senate confirmed Michael Pack to be USAGM Chief Executive Officer. In the early hours of June 18th, in Prague, where RFERL is headquartered, I received an email informing me that I had been removed from my post without cause. This action occurred without a single conversation between me and Michael Pack after he took office, which my understanding was the same case with the other network heads who were removed. I know that RFERL staff have subsequently reacted to my firing with shock, frustration, anger, and most concerning, uncertainty about RFERL's future. To date, more than 3 months later, no successors have been named to replace me or my counterparts at the other networks. Sadly, CEO PAC's arrival has brought only more chaos and uncertainty to U.S. international broadcasting. The turmoil could not come at a worse time. To be blunt, I fear we are falling behind our competitors in the information space. In a few short months, CEO PAC has put the agency he oversees and the grantee networks he funds, including RFERL, at significant and potentially irreparable risk. In my written testimony, I outlined several potential reforms to U.S. international broadcasting so that the U.S. can remain competitive in efforts to counter disinformation, support independent media, and strengthen democracies. First, to do this, Congress will need to increase funding for these tools of American soft power, but that obviously requires consistent, nonpartisan leadership of USAGM. But even beyond that, more significant actions will be required. Two I'd like to highlight here are for Congress to pass a new International Broadcasting Act that would clarify the roles and responsibilities of the various networks and examine the question of how best to explain American foreign policy to foreign audiences, which is the heart of recent Trump administration attacks on the agency. Second, as part of these reforms, I would urge Congress to make the private grantees, including RFERL, even more independent of the US government. Despite the firewall, their independence continues to be threatened. Their independence of these networks and their journalists is essential to their credibility with their audiences. It is what attracts listeners, readers, and viewers to their content. It's what allows RFERL's brave and intrepid journalists to take risks on a daily basis to report the truth. The politicization of USAGM and the undermining of the grantees' corporate boards by Mr. PAC are putting this credibility and their work at risk. I urge you to take action to ensure that this damage to these vital institutions does not go further. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fly. Now, Ambassador Crocker is next, but he's having some technology issues, so we're only going to hear his audio. But I'm sure he's got important things to tell us. So I now recognize you, Ambassador Crocker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall. Believe me, getting here this morning was not half the fun. I served on the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors from and later USAGM for almost 7 years, from August 2013 until June 2020. During that period, I was privileged to witness a complete makeover of the USAGM program. When I came aboard, the BBG was essentially an entity that was running without a CEO. It was as though a part-time board of governors was managing by remote an $800 million entity. It made no sense. So one of the first steps we took was to create a CEO position. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, you will recall this, we consulted broadly on the Hill, both sides of the aisle, to explain what the problem was with not having a CEO, and to seek support for naming one. We got that support, and after a vigorous search, we hired John Lansing, who has now moved on to be the CEO for NPR. Working with Mr. Lansing, the board turned to the next matter at hand, which was revitalizing and improving the various entities under the aegis of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Quality attracts quality. With Mr. Lansing at the helm, we were then able to proceed with the hiring of other entity heads. You have heard from two of them, Amanda Bennett and Jamie Fly. It doesn't get better than this. You have heard their testimony, you have seen their bios. These are the best of the best in the journalistic world. We also hired Alberto Fernandez, a former Foreign Service colleague of mine, to run the Middle East Broadcasting Network. Alberto has near perfect Arabic. Among other things, he was able to go on Arabic language talk shows and go head to head with our political adversaries. He could outthink them, he could outtalk them, and when necessary, he could outkill them in the defense of U.S. priorities and U.S. national security. So this is about the people who run these agencies and the people who do the frontline work as reporters. And Mr. Fly just described graphically the impact that these abrupt changes had on all of them. The other point I would make, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCall, is not just who was chosen, but how they were chosen. In each case, this bipartisan board came together, Republicans and Democrats. I am on the board as an independent, for unanimous votes appointing, again, these agency leaders. Now, all of that is in jeopardy, as you've heard from my former colleagues. The firewall in particular is a sensitive issue, and I am very worried that the cracks in the firewall are going to destroy the whole image of USAGM. And I would say in this context simply that I can't say it any better than what William Harlan Hale said in that first VOA broadcast, February 1942. Speaking in German and aiming to counter Nazi propaganda, he said, quote, "Here speaks a voice from America. Every day at this time, we will bring you the news of the war. The news may be good, the news may be bad. We shall tell you the truth." Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCall, that is what VOA and its sister agencies have done ever since. Our reputation for telling the truth has been a core element of our strength as a nation. Now it is in danger, putting at risk not only our national values, but also our national security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. I'll now recognize members of the committee for 5 minutes each. Pursuant to the rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And as we start questioning, I will start by recognizing myself. Mr. Turner, at the beginning of your testimony, you made clear just how qualified and experienced you are. We're grateful for your years of service, and I presume for much of that time, you've held a security clearance. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now, your testimony made clear that following Mr. Pak's arrival, when he began a pattern of improper and possibly illegal actions, you raised the alarm. Can you tell us a bit more specifically about who you notified and what their reactions were?
Initially, I didn't notify anyone outside of the agency. When a new agency head joins, you assume that they're going to change things. You assume that they want to get an understanding of the organization that they're heading. So, my purpose was to assist Mr. Pak in doing that. He initially put in place a freeze on personnel actions, on contract actions, and technical or IT migrations, which makes sense, when you first take this seat to get a hold of an agency. But then, then a week goes by, and 2 weeks goes by, and 3 weeks goes by, and you start seeing that things are really just frozen, and people are calling you saying things are breaking down. And I mentioned calls that I'm getting from the grantees saying that, if you don't send us funding, I'm not going to be able to make payroll next week. This is the CFO of Radio Free Europe. I mean, these are our partners in the broadcasting that we do internationally. They're key to the effectiveness of the agency, and starving them of resources and causing operational harm to them is not, how we intend to get our job done. Probably about a month into Mr. Pack's tenure, seeing lots of financial mismanagement, hearing from VOA reporters in particular about firewall violations, and being pushed one day to potentially commit an Anti-Deficiency Act violation. I apologize or take credit for the budget geeks in the room. I realized I had to notify someone, and I contacted the financial counterpart that works with us in the State Department's Office of the Inspector General. I made a disclosure, to them, and basically kind of just, laid out what I'd been seeing. I also reached out to the Government Accountability Office because they were working on an active review of U.S. AGM governance. And at the time I spoke with our Senate Appropriations Committee, majority and minority at the same time, along with our excellent General Counsel, David Kligerman, and we disclosed what we had been seeing, and I'll say, people were pretty shocked. Some of this has come out in the press, and it's just kind of a sad state of affairs for me, because I really like the agency, the people there, and the mission, and it's sad to see it assailed like this.
Thank you. Let me ask you this. Other than the fact that they did not follow your advice, did you have any reason to believe that CEO Pack or his close advisors were unhappy with you because of the concerns you had raised about financial mismanagement at the agency?
Yeah, I think, I've raised these tough issues with them. I said we can't, starve our organizations of resources. We have to provide them funding. They're almost 100% funded by the American taxpayer. I raised issues that, we can't lose important tools, such as those that are provided by our Open Technology Fund grantee. I told them, we can't just move money around willy-nilly, and they wanted to do some of that. At one point, they called back, without my awareness, about $3.5 million from our grantees. Without the CFO knowing, without our grants office being involved, without a grant agreement or amendment being executed, outside of all of our internal controls, calling up the grantees or sending them an email at 4 p.m. and saying, give us $500,000 by 5 p.m., this is ridiculous kind of stuff. So, we're having paper checks, delivered to us, for $3.5 million over the next couple of days, and I'm saying this is going to come back to haunt us. We can't do this, and I know that that did not endear me to Mr. Pack or the team that he had assembled around him. So I think there are lots of reasons.
Let me ask you some easy questions to answer. Did any of these communications meetings occur on or about August 12th?
Mr. Pack basically didn't communicate with me for much of his tenure, and I ended up communicating largely with his leadership team. I sent him probably 3, emails on important things in his first week on the job, and he didn't reply, to any of them. And, I got the message that I should work through the other folks around him. The first time I met with him was about 2 weeks before I was removed from my position, and I met with him on 2 different occasions that week, fairly close to the August 12th date that I was removed. And certainly there were some, pointed exchanges, shortly before he decided to remove me.
When you were removed, were 6 other senior officials placed on leave at the same time?
That's correct.
Do you know if any of the others who were suspended offered counsel to that effect?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Could you repeat that question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know if any of the others who were suspended offered counsel to that effect?
I think everyone was kind of summarily dismissed. They've sort of pulled our security clearances, for everyone, and said, because you don't have a clearance now and your job requires you to have a clearance, you can't be in your job. So it was a pretty quick thing. I might liken it a little bit to what we call our Wednesday night massacre, which was Mr. Pack's first physical day in the office, when he sort of decapitated all of our network organizations by firing their leadership and their boards, without any replacements, just removing them. And I think the 6 of us were removed because, we're sort of the folks who are following the regs and the rules and making sure that we're in compliance with what this institution asks of us, what the administration and OMB asks of us, and I think that was getting in their way.
Has Mr. Pack scheduled any administrative proceedings related to your suspension, and if so, when are those scheduled for?
Yes, sir, he did. The administrative hearings were scheduled for today, at the time of this committee hearing.
And when did you learn about those proceedings?
It was within the past week.
Do you believe that your suspension was in fact retaliatory in nature?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is. It sure feels like it. I've been a civil servant who's worked hard for both sides of the aisle, administrations of run by Republicans and Democrats, and I was here to help Mr. Pack. I think he would have had a better chance at achieving some success. I don't think he has a strategy, but it certainly feels retaliatory to me, and it's my view that that's the case with the others that were removed as well.
Well, it's my view, too. I think it was retaliatory. I think you did your job, tried to keep the agency's leadership on the straight and narrow, and told your superiors things they didn't want to hear, including that they might be breaking the law. So now they're trying to fire you. I think it's outrageous. So, Mr. Turner, I want to thank you. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing today. You are a public servant in the truest sense of the term. If it weren't for people like you, our government agencies would not function properly. They just crumble, and the gross mismanagement, people all over the world really would wonder why we weren't fulfilling our commitments. And if it weren't for people like you, the truth would never come to light when people in power abuse that power and think that the rules don't apply to them. So I salute you, and I can assure you this committee is going to have your back.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
yield back and recognize the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for 5 minutes.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first, before I begin my questions, enter into the record a letter to the Honorable Michael Pack on July 1st, 2020, signed by several United States senators, including Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and Susan Collins.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'd also like to enter into the record a joint statement with myself and Senator Marcia Blackburn on August 18th, expressing our extreme concerns by the state of affairs at USAGM.
Without objection.
Thank you. I've been heading this China task force up for the last 6 months. Voice of America took our Origins of COVID-19 report, which was almost like an indictment of the Chinese Communist Party and the cover-up that took place, all based on truth. We translated that into Mandarin. We got it through into mainland China, and the report went viral because the people of China need to know the truth about their government. This is a great example of what USAGM can do and how we can penetrate through their firewalls to talk to the people directly. It got the attention of President Xi's spokesman. There was an hour-long USGTN, their propaganda television show, an hour-long special debunking the McCall report. I mean, I find this is one of the most valuable things we have in the State Department, to talk directly to the people in China who are oppressed every day, talk to the people in Iran who are oppressed every day, people in Russia, in North Korea. So I see great value in this. And I don't want to see it destroyed or reduced by 80%, because $20 million that Congress appropriated has essentially been impounded. So my question is this, and I look, Ambassador Crocker, I have no greater respect for any ambassador more than him, who served in, Lebanon during the Marines bombing in Beirut, to the serving in last ambassador from Syria, Pakistan, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. My God. I mean, he always asks me a question, what did I do wrong? But he has done such a great job serving the United States of America in these outposts. Nobody knows this better than he does. So I'd like to pose my question actually to you, Mr. Turner, but also if I could give Ambassador Crocker and Ambassador Kornblue some time to talk about what impact are the actions of Mr. Pak and this purging and also basically, I would say, borderline actions in defiance of congressional intent and appropriations. What impact is that having on our foreign policy? I don't think the top of the State Department, I would urge Secretary Pompeo to take a look at what's going on within his own department. This undermines the very things we're trying to achieve. The very goals that Secretary Pompeo and I have talked about, I believe these actions undermine that. And finally, Ambassador Crocker, you say, our reputation for telling the truth has been a core element of our strength as a nation. Now it is in danger, putting at risk not only our national values, but also our national security. Ambassador Crocker, I put great value in those words from probably the most esteemed ambassador the United States has ever had. So with that, Ambassador Crocker, I'd like for you and Ambassador Cornblue to respond to that, and then Mr. Turner, since you're here in person, it would be nice to have your response.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCall, and thank you for those kind words. I would stress again here that I am politically and independent. That is the status I assiduously protected during my years in the Foreign Service, and I continue to do so. I would say this. I was an ambassador to 6 countries in my career. I served Republican administrations for 3 of those terms and Democratic administrations for the other 3. I do say with a total lack of modesty that I think I've got a pretty good feel for what works and what doesn't, what's right and what isn't. What we got right were the right people in the right places. And we did this by unanimous bipartisan board votes. Bipartisanship is a increasingly short supply. And I commend you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. McCall, for keeping that spirit alive in this critical committee. It is about telling the truth. It is not about disseminating propaganda. That is what our adversaries do in Russia and China. Since 1942, our national reputation has been reinforced by the activities and the reporting of the USAGM grantees and entities. It started from day one, as I said in my statement. When we deviate from we are putting at risk our leadership role in the world. We are effectively in the minds of so many. Mr. McCall, you referred to your superb China report. Our strength vis-a-vis the Chinese government is that we do tell the truth. That's when a report like this is produced and when VOA and others broadcast it, our listeners around the world pay attention because of our reputation for truth. When you take that away, we become like our adversaries. Not better than them, simply doing what they do. People figure that out. Damage has been done. I think there's no question about that. Our legitimacy, our reputation for candor, our reputation for truth has already been significantly undermined. And when that happens, the rest of our foreign policy initiatives are undermined. People are not stupid. They know what they're hearing. They know what the truth sounds like. They know who tells it. That was axiomatic until June with these mass firings. And I would say, if I could just echo what you already said, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCall, it wasn't just us on the boards who were dismissed. It was also the case of some very, very top-notch senior executives. That is what Mr. Turner represents. The best in the business. The best in the business at what they do, with a complete understanding of what the firewall is and how it is important. And in all of this mess we've had since June, one of the things I regret the most is how these individuals were treated. And I'm very happy to hear that the committee will stand by these brave individuals. You don't get better than the civil service, just as you don't get a better set of empty heads than we had with Ms. Bennett, Mr. Fly, and their colleagues. And finally, on China, if I could just say a word, two other people that deserve mention and deserve praise for what they did. That would be Libby Liu and Bei Fang. Libby, of course, headed Radio Free Asia before she stepped up to direct the OTF entity newly established, and they then replaced her at RFA. If you want people who can get into the minds of the regime in China, to worry them, makes them feel that they are coming under fire for their lies they tell people, do not find better people than Libby and Bay to send that message. So I would, as a former career foreign service officer, I just want to salute the extraordinary quality of career people as well as other appointments who have carried the message of America abroad for so long. It pains me greatly to see us moving into an era where that may no longer be the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for your service. And now that my time has expired, I would just ask that the witnesses, all the witnesses appearing before the committee today, respond to my question in writing. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. The gentleman yields back. Mr. Sherman.
Our communications efforts illustrate for the world our democracy and the rule of law. That can work only if lawmakers are able to do their job. Mr. Park's refusal to be here demonstrates to the many who depend upon our communications efforts that there that it's not, that at least in that instance, our democracy is not working well. But this hearing illustrates also the opposite. We have issued a bipartisan subpoena for Mr. Park. And without objection, I'd like to enter into the record Mr. McCall's statement on this issue and the need for a subpoena. And I think then that this instance can help us demonstrate to the world that the rule of law does work here, and that it is important for this committee to make sure this matter doesn't drop, that there are consequences for Mr. Park no matter which administration takes office in January. I'm a bit confused as to Mr. Park's mission. I thought at first it might be just megalomania, desire to replace one person with another person to show he can. Then I thought it might be some extreme libertarian budget cutting, but the soft power of the United States costs almost nothing compared to our military forces and doesn't endanger our servicemen and women. And then we discover the one ideological issue, and I've focused, as the committee knows, on our broadcasting and other communications efforts to Pakistan. I've urged that we have a Sindh service as well as one in Urdu. And in the Urdu service, they covered for a couple of minutes an appeal by Biden to American Muslim voters, which at some point should be balanced by a demonstration that both parties want the votes of every group of Americans, and that Muslims and all the communities of the United States are a treasured part of the mosaic of the United States. As one witness pointed out, our broadcasting and other efforts represents government-funded independent journalism. That is a tricky thing to do. And that's why we prohibit these organizations from communicating with the American people, because there could be some effect on our elections. Now, it's possible that some American voter saw this little clip of Biden saying that Democrats want Muslim votes. And it's possible that the Urdu service has not yet communicated that Republicans want Muslim votes. But clearly, we're all in the politics business here. We all communicate with different ethnic groups. You could certainly influence more Muslim American voters with $1,000 spent on media that actually reaches Americans than you could with some obscure, with all due respect, not a lot of Americans are focused on just a minute or two broadcast of your Urdu service. What particularly concerns me, though, is the J-1 visas. We bring people here. We ask them to be honest and to speak truth to countries where speaking truth can get you killed, or at least imprisoned. Then Mr. Park denies their the application, refuses to file the application to extend their J-1 visas, which means they're subject to deportation to the very place that we ask them to tell truth to a country where truth is illegal. I'd like any of the witnesses, but particularly Mr. Turner, to comment. Are lives in danger because of Mr. Park's efforts? Or is the freedom of these journalists in danger if they get deported?
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest worries of the people that have been removed and the folks that are appearing at this hearing today is the fate of these J-1 visa holders. You know, they are a very, very specialized expertise that we need.
And if we see them here in the hallways.
Yeah.
When American journalists are not interested in some hearing of this committee, they may be the only journalists.
Correct.
And they're asking questions, and they're saying things that might get them in trouble if they were back in their home countries.
Yeah.
And Mr. Park wants to send them there?
It could be quite dangerous for many of them. Obviously, in certain countries, Russia, Iran, Vietnam, China, many places around the world, the broadcasting that they're doing for the United States is not welcome. You know, they want to close off their media markets, you know, from the truth. You know, these people are very passionate people. You know, they come from these countries, and they often want to drive change in their countries. You know, they want, you know, American values to, you know, to go to their communities. You know, respect for human dignity, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And that's why they're, you know, walking around the halls sometimes when other folks, you know, have given up. They really care. They're difficult to recruit because it's hard to find a great reporter in some of these really, you know, specific, you know, languages. You know, whether it's Urdu, as you mentioned, or if we're recruiting a Sindhi journalist or Macedonian. You know, they come from the countries. They have a real tactile feel for the communities and the people.
And Uncle Sam brings them here, uses them to communicate our message back to their home countries, and then deports them to the loving arms of the very dictators who were so opposed to truth that we thought it was necessary to broadcast into their country. I believe my time has expired. I yield back, but that's a crime.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, the harassment, the potential imprisonment, even worse, I think are at risk for some of our journalists if they are returned.
We ought to be granting asylum, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my appreciation to you and the Ranking Member McCall for holding this hearing. I'd like to express my appreciation for your leadership to the two of you. Particularly in your introduction of the Open Technology Fund Authorization Act. It was my real pleasure to be the Republican co-lead on that bill. The Open Technology Fund is a vital part of helping journalists and democracy activists around the world. I think of China's firewall and how important it is in that role. I think of Iran. And when it was used last January to restore the internet, when hundreds of protesters had been killed, how incredibly important it is in that role. And as I'm listening to this hearing, trying to not place nefarious motives on Mr. Pack, excuse me. I wish he was here to defend himself, because in his absence, we're left to speculate as to his motives, and they just don't sound good. And I hope eventually we'll understand what those are. Mr. McCall has talked about the role of the OTF in China. I'd like to point out two other regions of the world and ask some specific questions. Perhaps Ambassador Kornblue, you can help me. In Belarus, has there been a role of the OTF, and if so, how has it impacted that, and what obstacles are we encountering in Belarus?
Thank you very much for your question. I did want to start first by echoing what my colleague, Ambassador Crocker, said about the importance and the professionalism and expertise of people, leaders that we recruited, and call out OTF's leadership, including Laura Cunningham. She and her team are working under incredible pressure, and I just admire their work very, very much. On Belarus specifically, OTF has supported internet freedom projects for Belarus for over 5 years. Unfortunately, due to the funding freeze, OTF has been forced to issue stop work orders to all of its Belarus projects. Prior to the stop work orders, OTF has been supporting the most popular anti-censorship and secure communications tools in Belarus, including Siphon, Tor, and Signal. And OTF also provided digital security support to Belarus civil society groups. It funded secure hosting and cyber attack mitigation platforms for Belarusian civil society. It developed peer-to-peer solutions to combat internet blackouts. And it funded cutting-edge network monitoring tools to better understand and ultimately overcome censorship in Belarus. This shows you the multi-pronged approach that OTF takes, both focusing on funding the technology and empowering the people and protecting them. Despite ongoing funding challenges, OTF has continued to try to find ways to support journalists and civil society in Belarus during this critical time. For example, after the Belarusian government announced that it had blocked all RFE-RL websites, OTF worked quickly to spin up several mirror sites so that Belarusians could continue to access RFE-RL's website.
Thank you. It would be hard to imagine a better dollar-for-dollar investment for the results in these cases that we've mentioned and in Belarus. Quickly, before I run out of time, Mr. Fly, would you speak to the Radio Free Europe, the role Radio Free Europe plays, particularly combating Russian aggression in Europe?
RFERL plays an essential role. We were just discussing Belarus, where RFERL has a Belarusian language service, Radio Svoboda, which for decades has provided hope and inspiration to the Belarusian people. And in moments like this, when the people are taking their future into their own hands, has played a key role trying to share information between the people about what's going on in the streets, about what the government is doing, about the crackdown, revealing the truth about the crackdown. And as Ambassador Kornbluh said, networks like RFE, as part of the USAGM family, rely on entities like OTF to help circumvent a lot of the restrictions that governments impose on our broadcast or our distribution. Beyond Belarus, another key role that RFERL plays is inside Russia itself, where it has a Russian service, a 24/7 Russian TV network, current time in cooperation with Voice of America, and has been doing increasingly important digital work, reaching a younger generation of Russians. And in response to that, the Russian government has been cracking down, declaring RFERL a foreign agent, trying to force its journalists out of the country. Despite that, they continue operating out of a relatively large bureau in Moscow, putting themselves and their families on the line, covering a wide range of issues from the pandemic to politics. And through all of these services in Russia and outside, we're pushing back against Russian efforts to control the information space.
Thank you, Mr. Fly, and the rest of the witnesses. I'm out of time. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Mr. Sires.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. And Mr. Turner, thank you for your strength and your courage to come before this committee. And my friend there, Michael Pack, you know, this committee works on a bipartisan basis. We fund you on a bipartisan basis. All the people that you see around this room here that have the portraits here all supported the efforts of that agency. And here you have this hack coming in and destroying some of the most important things that America can do. I came from a country that is very repressive. I came from Cuba. I know what repression is. I know what repression of the press is. I know what stories are that make it to the front page. I've been called a member of the mafia, along with Mario Diaz-Balart, with Senator Menendez, in the front page of the Cuban paper. We need to combat that. And the agency that does that is this, the Voice of America, and the people that work there. So when you have somebody like this, who Senator Menendez questioned his confirmation from the very beginning that he was not, it was someone that had questionable qualifications to head this agency, who's under investigation by the IRS. It makes you wonder how these people get confirmed to lead an agency so important as this one. Someone who's endangering people, these journalists who are so courageous in these countries. Because if these people have to go back to their countries, you know that they're going to be harassed, put in jail, or killed. So I am very concerned about the direction that this agency is going. As chairman of the Western Hemisphere, I'm concerned about what's going on in Venezuela, this information there, what's going on now in Nicaragua. He's shutting down the newspapers. He's shutting down the independent journalists. And we are the only buffer. We are the only people that can give the truth to those who live in those countries. And that's just two of the countries. Not to talk about Russia and Belarus and all the other places that we have. So I find it a little bit conspicuous that one of the things that seems to be happening is that we are destroying our efforts to go into Russia and tell the truth to the Russian people because of the chummy relationship that our president has with Putin. I wonder what goes on in those conversations where we don't get a transcript of. Is this a result of that?
I know people are very concerned about the politicization, of the agency, and I know that's a primary concern of this committee. As you point out, the value is in the truth and getting that information out there. I think Mr. Pack has just forced the agency to stagnate, and stagnation and decline may be a bit of its future. You mentioned Cuba. In 2018, this is a country with the highest growth in internet access in the world. They started from a very low base.
And we worked very hard to get there.
Yeah, and there are opportunities now, as there are in China, as there are in other markets around the world. And this team doesn't seem to be focused on a strategy. It doesn't seem to be focused on how to get the best bang for our buck, to look at our audiences and the platforms and how to engage the world with truthful information and information about our policies. And I think that's one of the biggest downsides right now, in addition to the loss of credibility, is we're losing time in a critical moment.
One of the things that bothers me is how people can ignore a subpoena from a committee. To me, that bothers me to no end, because there should be some consequences for these people who do not want to answer of their actions that they're committing in the work that they do. When we fund them, it's the taxpayers' money. And we're entitled to know where that money goes and why they make the decisions that they make. So to me, we have to change this idea that people just can ignore a subpoena from a committee. My time is running out, but I thank you for your courage in coming here.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Cires. Mr. Perry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will tell you, I wouldn't know Mr. Pack if he was standing right in front of me, and this seems like a pretty substantial hit job on him and his actions and et cetera, but I want to point out some things that apparently aren't going to be pointed out by anybody else here. Last June, a former chief strategy officer for the agency, working closely with the former CEO of USAGM, went to prison for stealing nearly $40,000 during his tenure. In 2018, a reporter and a cameraman faked a mortar attack in Nicaragua. Well, that's interesting reporting. In the fall of 2018, the Voice of America fired 15 of its employees after discovering they were accepting bribes from a Nigerian official. Wonderful. The Hoover Institution released a report citing concerns on China's influence on American institutions, including China's charm offensive on agencies like the VOA and the CCP's proclivity to otherwise threaten VOA reporters and their families. Boy, I bet we love to hear that's going on. In late 2018, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, this committee with these people on it, said the USAGM was a broken agency. But I guess, according to what we're hearing today, we should just let it go, just let it continue. Former Secretary Clinton described USAGM as a practically defunct in its capacity to tell a message around the world. I'm glad we're paying for that. When Mr. Pack went to investigate the Open Technology Fund at their D.C. location, his employees found laptops and hard drives left unsecured in boxes. An internal door connecting the Open Technology Fund organization with other entities in the building complex wasn't only unlocked, it was wide open. I suspect the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, none of them have any interest in finding out what might be in those computers. China, Russia, and other adversaries are constantly trying to hack U.S. agencies. This discovery wasn't a great look for the OTF. Apparently, OTF has also been holding meetings on Zoom calls. Well, that sounds pretty secure to me as an individual who's been privileged and honored to hold a top secret security clearance for about 35 years in the U.S. military. Mr. Chairman, I want to enter for the record a letter from Mr. Pack to you where he says that his staff proposed 8 days within the month of September when they could appear. If you would, sir.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, this committee respects the importance of media independence. Media freedom is absolutely essential to any functioning civil society. And we are aware and familiar with the firewall put in place to protect journalists working at USAGM and its subdivisions from political interference. We all support such protections for our journalists and reporters. Highlighting some of the issues will shed light as to why Mr. Pack was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to his current role and the charge that is now before him to reform the agency. Let's start out with a newly released report from the Office of Personnel and Management detailing USAGM's poor vetting practices for its employees. 1,500 USAGM employees and contractors between 2010 and 2020, that's right now in case anybody's wondering, 40% of the agency's workforce were not properly vetted before being hired. Well, I don't know. Who should Mr. Pack look towards that for accountability there? Should he look towards us sitting up here? I don't know. I would think it'd be the people running the agency. According to Real Clear Politics, the agency cleared hundreds of employees and contractors to work for the U.S. government, many from authoritarian nations the U.S. considers adversaries. These unvetted employees maintained access to USAGM broadcasting platforms and tools, government buildings, IT systems, and senior government officials. Oh, I wonder why this agency is incompetent and ineffective and inept. I wonder why. I have no idea. The reforms undertaken by Mr. Pack have undergone a significant amount of public scrutiny, as they should. But USAGM's poor vetting procedures over those last decades continue to threaten U.S. national security, and it's entirely the fault of those who mismanage the process, whoever that is. Both USAGM and the State Department employees have said that OTF's budget can be broken down into two parts. Approximately 25% of it spent on technology tools that facilitate its mission to break through barriers of authoritarian technology control, 25%, and I'll conclude, Mr. Chairman. The other 75% is dedicated to extravagant conferences at popular resort spots, extremely generous salaries, benefits, and redundant projects already being undertaken at other agencies. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not ready to blame Mr. Pack for everything. He should be allowed to come in here, and we should work collaboratively instead of the roadshow and the circus that is going on right now in this committee. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Let me just say that Mr. Pack had every opportunity to be here today to defend himself and his actions. He's the one who chose not to come and to ignore this committee. And in terms of the dates that he proposed to come to us, and you said we didn't accept it. Those proposed dates were in October when the House is in recess, so it made no sense for him to come when the House is in recess. He could have come today and defended himself, and he could have given us some dates. We would have been happy to accommodate him. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's a fallacy in the logic of my friend who just spoke. In positing that there were a series of problems over the last 10 or 20 years, and that's why we had to have a total purge and the dismantlement of programs that in fact are effective, reach audiences, and propound a democratic point of view in authoritarian societies. That is false logic. If there are problems, you clean them up. You don't dismantle and purge the organization. And that's what we're talking about. And if the actions Mr. Perry says are justifiable, then I would assume Mr. Pack would run that walk to this hearing to propound his philosophy and defend his actions and explain them. His absence speaks volumes. about the fact that he, A, does not believe apparently in his own personal accountability while justifying his purges as an act of accountability for others. And he apparently doesn't have the confidence in his own actions and so-called reforms to come before the committee and justify them. Ms. Kornbluh, I was really bowled over by your testimony because you enumerated the actual consequences of the actions undertaken by Mr. Pack on a wide swath of the world in terms of programs. Is it your view that while painful, what Mr. Pack is doing is just cleaning up problems that were ignored by predecessors? And is it your view that apparently my friend from Pennsylvania wants us to believe that the organization is just replete with people who are partying on the taxpayer dime and, you know, being callous about their computers and frankly being ineffectual in their work? Is that a fair characterization in your view of the organization whose board you chair?
Thank you so much for giving me a chance to respond. It's hard not to be emotional about this because the team at OTF, it's a small team. There are 10 people. They've voluntarily taken a pay cut under the financial pressure that the agency is in because they care so much about the mission and vulnerable journalists and human rights activists and ordinary people around the world who are using their tools and services. I'd love to be able to submit for the record fuller responses, but needless to say, I believe that the congressman has been misinformed. The security claims are just not true. We don't leave information on hard drives. We don't use Zoom. 90% of the funding is used for programming, for technology. There are no $2 million in conferences. I think there must be a problem with somebody reading some numbers. In the past, we've spent $200,000 on bringing together civil society groups, but nothing like $2 million in light of the epidemic. Of course, we haven't been bringing people together at all. So those claims are unfortunately not true.
Wait a minute. I want to get this straight. So you all did not spend $2 million on Donald Trump owned properties like Mar-a-Lago or, I mean, you know, that was the Secret Service. Sorry, maybe my friend got that mixed up.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question here because my time's going to run out, but again, going back to your testimony, which was so compelling in terms of the damage being done here, the opportunity costs we're incurring, and it's a self-inflicted incurrence. You know, in criminal law, one of the questions always asked when investigators are looking at a crime is cui bono, who benefits? When we look at what Mr. Pack has done to this organization, who benefits? It seems to me, deliberate or otherwise, Mr. Pack is handing a gift to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the Iranians, and the Venezuelans. But maybe that's just me. What do you think?
I think, unfortunately, that the actions taken against the Open Technology Fund strengthen America's adversaries and competitors. It threatens authoritarians around the world by weakening a key element of American soft power.
I want to give Mr. Bennett or Mr. Fly, Ms. Bennett or Mr. Fly an opportunity to respond as well, if I have time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you don't, but if they speed it up, we'll let them get a few words in.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your graciousness.
I'm happy to give a quick response to some of the things that Congressman Perry brought up. It's true, we had a chief strategy officer a couple of years ago who was faking travel. We fired him. I signed that letter. We don't put up with that. There was questions about a mortar attack and how video was edited at Office of Cuba Broadcasting. They have been investigating it and proposing those people, two people, for removal because they care about their credibility. The Nigerian, it was our House of Staff, someone left envelopes, a dignitary who came to visit, and we can't have the appearance that there's any influence on the journalism. So VOA removed those people. OTF does not have hard drives. They're a cloud-based system. I don't know what was seen on the floors when they went into the office. They haven't been operating there. They've been mostly working from home because of the pandemic. Typically, I have not used Zoom with them. Jitsi is a product that they funded, which is secure, and they use that tool. As far as the OPM report, they dinged us for a lot of administrative things, and we've been trying to resolve those. There were 37 items in the report that they delivered. We have addressed more than half of those. There was no recommendation that we should remove people from their jobs because, there was not an MOU in place, which is the reason that, that they pointed to. Ultimately, we're not a national security agency. Mr. Pack is making it seem like national security is at risk here. If you're a VOA journalist and sit down at your desk, you can't log into any national security database. It's a building full of journalists. Our grantees are buildings full of journalists who are running down stories by talking to congressmen like yourselves, newsmakers. So I think it's really just sort of pretext and a good cover for taking some, abhorrent actions.
Yeah, the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank y'all for being here. I'd like to deviate from the current conversation and talk a little bit about Belarus. Mr. Turner, while you were CFO, did you review any proposed plan for Radio Free Europe to surge its broadcast or increase support for Free Belarus in light of the present protests that have erupted there?
I don't recall that specifically. Obviously, that's an important country in Radio Free Europe's portfolio. We give wide discretion in terms of the use of budgetary resources to our grantees. So Jamie Fly, as the leader of that organization, really has the say over where is the money best spent. So I would defer to him on maybe specific questions about Belarus and Radio Sloboda.
Okay, well, let me just ask you this then. If something like that were to happen, walk me through the process to where there would be that ramp up, so to speak, and what's the ultimate goal? Oddly enough, the first time I remember hearing about Radio Free Europe my whole life, and then in college, this little band out of Georgia called REM was playing on the Cumberland Avenue Strip and came out with this song, Radio Free Europe, and we all thought it was cool, but we never really understood what it was about. But I see several people in the audience nodding that they were, in fact, their age group is in mine, so that's cool. But I would like to know that process, if you would. It's not even in my notes. It came to me. I'm just curious how that whole thing works. And what's the goal? I mean, do you get on there and just pro freedom, pro what, and then how does it work? How do you get the people to listen, first of all? I mean,
Yeah, it's amazing just sort of the power of the truth. The ranking member talked about China and the start of the pandemic, and we saw our numbers in China shoot up tremendously after the coronavirus broke out because people in Wuhan are looking around and they know something bad is happening and their government is not telling them what it is. So they were flocking to Radio Free Asia. They're flocking to VOA to find that truthful information. We saw that in Iran when protests broke out this summer over the kind of the dire economic straits there. We saw it after the killing of General Soleimani, where our numbers shoot up. When there are cases where we really want to try to surge into an area and increase maybe the number of frequencies that we're broadcasting on, or add additional hours of television or radio, which is mostly staff time. It's mostly people in studios and cameras that are involved in this. We kind of circle the wagons and pull together the funding in order to provide that surge. We keep approximately 1% of our $800 million budget as sort of an emergency fund. And if we get through the year without an enormous crisis that we need to tap into it, then it gets spent on the normal things that we do. It's around $8 million. So we would have a discussion, first of all, with the head of Radio Free Europe So in this case, we would have discussed this with Jamie Fly. And if he needed resources, we would dispatch that to him. It's really up to him as to how he wants to deploy that. Is it more people on the ground? Do we need technology support from OTF? In many places around the globe, OTF quietly is providing support to protesters. So the Hong Kong protesters are protecting their identities from surveillance by OTF tools. Protesters in Iran, we've seen it in Beirut. Around the world, people are using these tools to protect themselves. So we would surge funds on technology and also to the broadcasting operations.
How do you know who else watching it? I mean, what are your ratings? How does that work?
Some tools, some information is easier. On digital and social media, we often get metrics from the platform. So on whether if it's YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, or a particular platform that might be specific to a country, we often can get that digital information. Other times, we actually use surveys. Gallup is one of our biggest providers, and sometimes it seems strange, but we have
Gallup can
will
trace
call
that.
up folks in Iran, and they will.
When Congressman McCall put that deal out on China, I mean, I heard a lot about that.
Yeah.
And that was like, I guess, if he were to walk the streets of China, he probably couldn't walk the streets. They'd probably all be asking for his autograph.
Yeah.
So
It's the power of the truth. A report like that, comes out,
Yeah.
and obviously it elicits a strong reaction, from the CCP because, they fear, that kind of truth, and the information that we provide is just unvarnished truth at the highest journalistic, quality.
all right, very cool. Yeah. So nobody on there is speaking with my accent, I assume.
Yeah, well.
We already got freedom in Tennessee. We're Radio Free Tennessee all the time, so we're cool. But
they would like it. It's amazing how our audiences really are interested in America. They we are kind of a cultural touchstone for the world, and people want to know what people are doing, what we're thinking about. Teens in China want to know what teens in America think about different issues.
Right.
So it could be a kid on the streets of Knoxville. If we were interviewing him and translating it to Mandarin, kids in China will be listening. Kids in Cuba would want to know what are teens thinking about.
I've run over, but I pretty much say for the record that they would probably need a translator for me. So
we have a lot.
As many of the members of this committee will attest that they need one as well. But I will go on record. I know I've gone over, Mr. Chairman, but East Tennessee, specifically the 2nd Congressional District, is the only place in America where people do not speak with an accent. So thank you.
Mr. Burchett, I let you speak longer because I just love your accent.
Thank you, brother. That's really cool. I appreciate that. I always notice that Representative Omar, sometimes when I just saw her in here, but she's walked out, but sometimes when I speak, she gets a grin on her face, and I'm not sure what that's about, but
thank you.
That's cool with me. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to you and the ranking member for holding this really critically important hearing today. And I'm really grateful to all of the witnesses for coming and sharing your experiences. I'd like to spend the time I have focusing on the role of journalists in the efforts of that we've been discussing today. And Ms. Bennett, I think I'm going to direct most of my questions to you to try to tap into your illustrious career as a decorated and accomplished journalist. And so let me just go through some of these. First, can you explain the firewall that exists? Tell us what that is, why it's so important to independent journalism.
Yes, thank you for asking that. A firewall of sorts, although it's not called that, exists in virtually every news organization, at least in this country. And the purpose of this firewall is to allow the journalists to operate independently without reference to any kind of pressure from, in the private sector, it's from the people who provide the money, from the advertising sides, from the circulation side, from people who in the community would want to put pressure on you not to cover one thing or another or to cover it in a specific way. That firewall is a matter, it's not called a firewall in the private industry, but it does very clearly exist. I operate for most of my career under that system. Moving into USAGM, it was actually a system that was codified into law and practice. And that meant that the journalists are free to make decisions on what they cover, as Mr. Turner just remarked on, where you cover, how you cover it, what journalists you hire, what journalists you discipline and for what purpose, how you maintain critical standards. Those things are all handled by the journalists without reference to pressure from the outside, because even an identical operation, so for example, disciplining someone for biased coverage, it's different when it's done by a journalist who has no actual association with either side of that argument than when it is by people who have some kind of connection with that.
Right. So thank you very much. So let me ask you then, for VOA journalists who are being fired, who are being forced to leave the country, can you speak to some of the possible scenarios that they might face when they return home?
Well, again, as I mentioned, I'm no longer there, so I can't speak to specific things that are happening there, but I can say that one of the things we are always acutely aware of with all our journalists is the dangers they face back home from the reporting that they do, whether they are in this country or out of this country. Their families are facing pressure. Many of the people who are coming to us from other countries are some of the bravest people I know. I in a 40-year career, used to hear people talk about courageous journalism, and I've said to my colleagues now, I didn't know what that meant until I came to VOA and watched the kind of pressure from a variety of different things: financial pressure, physical pressure, imprisonment. We've had to repeatedly over my career at VOA, I've had to deal with extricating journalists from very, very difficult and dangerous situations. So the fact that journalists who are sent home without suddenly, it certainly could be a danger.
So let me be a little more specific. On August 31st, a group of veteran VOA journalists penned a letter to the acting director saying that, and I quote, "The purge appears to be expanding to include U.S. permanent residents and even U.S. recklessly expressing that being a journalist is a great cover for a spy," close quote. Can you share with us, given your experience in a very long and successful career as a journalist, highlight why that kind of remark is so dangerous, not just to the lives of journalists, but also to truth and transparency, which we all know are critical cornerstones of democracy?
Well, you know, again, without reference to that specific document, which I think speaks very much for itself, I would say that fighting the perception that journalists are spies is one of the most critical factors, particularly in reporting from danger zones. As my colleague, my former colleague, Bei Feng, who was the former head of Radio Free Asia, who did work in conflict zones, explains, that is something you really had to be very careful with, because it would endanger the lives of journalists who were operating in these countries. So suggestions that journalists are spies is a very critical and very dangerous thing to do. As for the issues with the security clearance, I think Mr. Turner explained it very, very well. And in fact, that part of the issue with the vetting procedures that were being scrutinized was that VOA and USAGM were actually trying to use a more stringent vetting procedure that was more appropriate for people who had been living in foreign countries. So it was not that we were doing a less significant procedure. It was that we were trying to do a more significant procedure. So that's part of the issue, was to make sure that these things, the reality and the perception, matched.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bennett. I appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, I join with so many of my colleagues in expressing my great frustration and regret and anger that Mr. Pack is not here to respond to these kinds of questions and to explain to us why he would utter statements like that are reckless and dangerous, and to actually address our concerns. I hope that we'll have the opportunity. I suspect not, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with this illustrious panel of witnesses and to hear from them today. Thanks so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing. This is just so discouraging to see another part of our government that has just been so compromised. First, but I'm looking at what's going on at the State Department, and now to see this. I wanted to know if you could describe to me what UltraSurf is and who's been pushing it, and what the problems with it are. I'm not sure whichever witness would like to respond to this.
I think maybe I should try. I don't have a lot of background on UltraSurf. You know that technology that was rejected by the State Department and the USAGM's office because the technology did not appear to be satisfactory. It's not an open source technology, and that's the limit of what I can say about it as the chair. I haven't been involved in evaluating it.
I could also add that it is an internet circumvention tool. It focused largely on China. As Ambassador Kornblue mentioned, it is an open source, which is the very and hasn't been subjected to a really rigorous code review and audit. We've been unable to fund that tool or work with that organization through OTF because they're not in compliance with the rigorous sort of security reviews that OTF does. Obviously, when you have these tools that people are risking their lives on, you know, if the government knows that they're accessing our content, or perhaps if they're a human rights activist or a protester, it's very dangerous to them. So we really want to have the highest assurance that it's completely safe. We have other tools which reach China very, very effectively, and that's sort of my extent of my knowledge of UltraSurf as well. But I'm sure the agency could provide additional information, and OTF as well.
Either one of you? Hello, can you guys hear me? Ambassador?
Ms. Bass, can you repeat that because we didn't hear you for part of the time?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Mr. Chairman.
We couldn't hear part of what you were saying, so if you could please repeat it.
Oh, sure. I was just saying, who's been pushing UltraSurf? Who has been pushing the U.S. government to support it? And maybe because the connection has been a little dicey, I didn't hear if you guys responded to that before.
Grant, do you have more information on that?
You know, I believe the UltraSurf organization has worked in the past with the Lantos Foundation, and they've, I think, represented them in some forums, but I don't know much more beyond that. You know, other than we're, of course, very willing to consider tools that meet our requirements.
Congresswoman, we'd be happy to supply more information for the record for you.
Okay, all right, and this is to all of you. Has Mr. Pack ever given any indication that he would demand loyalty from U.S. AGM staff and try to push out those who he didn't consider loyal? That's it. Crocker? Anybody? Is it difficult to hear me, or what's going on?
We can hear you now.
Congresswoman, this is Jamie Fly. I'll just say, at least in my case, there was no demand of loyalty because there was no conversation, which I think was the case with the other network heads. So at least with those of us at the networks who were removed very early, as Grant said on his first day in the office. He didn't have time to ask for loyalty because he didn't bother to talk to us.
And if I'm not mistaken in your earlier testimony, it's not as though you were advised that anything that you did was improper.
No, it was clear in the letter that removed me, and in the one conversation I had with him about 10 days later, that I was removed without cause.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bass. Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. I'd like to ask maybe Jamie Fly or any of the others who might want to respond to this. But back in 2014, when Kaja Izmailova was arrested, a Radio Free Europe reporter, but an indigenous person to Azerbaijan, on really trumped up politically charged charges that included, that sent her to prison for 7 years, or at least got a prison sentence. She was serving some of it. I held a hearing. We had the Vice President, Editor-in-Chief of Programming for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, come and testify, gave great testimony on her behalf. I introduced a bill called the Azerbaijan Human Rights Act, and it listed people like her who had been unfairly incarcerated and on politically trumped up charges. And she had pointed out, frankly, how corrupt Aliyev was, and for that she was harshly punished. I wonder, fast forward to right now with Belarus and what's happening there. Many of us have spoken out repeatedly for decades against Alexander Lukashenko, who was dubbed for years as the last dictator of Europe. Of course, now we again have Putin. But the problem is that he is a charmer, even though he's a harsh man. And for a while there, it looked like he was getting some traction with Europe and with ourselves, with the United States. He did let out most of the political prisoners, but the recent crackdown and the gross mistreatment of the opposition is calling out for, again, for us to be in absolute solidarity with the Democrats who are seeking a better life for all Belarusians. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, if you would, where are we on Azerbaijan? I know this isn't as much of a focused hearing on country-specific concerns, and is there plans to ratchet up the effort even more so for Belarus? Because they, obviously the media is totally controlled by Lukashenko. We know that RT now is running the media, as are other operatives from the Kremlin. Not that the ones that they replaced were any better, but it's truly a one monopoly. And the message is all Lukashenko, Lukashenko, Lukashenko. So again, in order to pierce that very, very dangerous disinformation campaign, is RFL ratcheting up its efforts vis-a-vis Belarus?
Thanks for those questions, Congressman. And thanks for your advocacy on behalf of Khadija. And it goes without saying to other members as well who often weigh in on behalf of our PRL journalists from my tenure. In Azerbaijan, we have a strong service. We were kicked out of the country when Khadija was the bureau chief because of her investigative reporting about the wealth of the ruling family. So we operate out of Prague, but provide a key service to the Azeri people. Khadija's, the pressure on Khadija happened well before my tenure, but upon taking office, I tried to engage her directly to help her resolve her outstanding issues with the Azeri government, and worked with a number of members of Congress and with the Department of State on her behalf. I unfortunately report that she still is facing a travel ban, although she is not in prison anymore, but she's not able to travel internationally, which she was trying to do prior to the pandemic. So her case continues to need support. In Belarus, to pick up on what Grant Turner was talking about earlier, RFRL has had a strong service for decades. This is really the moment that a service like Svoboda steps up, covers protests. My former colleagues tell me that since June, Our journalists at Svoboda have spent a combined total of 125 days behind bars. They've been picked up 16 times while reporting live on the pre and post-election protests. So they are out there on the streets putting themselves at risk. And what they need, to pick up on what Grant was talking about earlier, what they would normally look to USAGM for is surge support. They would look for additional resources to get up on, in this case, the radio airwaves, since the internet is often being blocked. My understanding is RFERL has gone up on radio again temporarily to deal with this crisis, but it's had to pay for it out of its own pocket because of the lack of a response from Mr. Pack and his team at USAGM. They would be looking for USAGM support in engaging the State Department when their journalists are in prison, as some are, when they're picked up and detained, when their accreditation is stripped. It's not just the Belarusian journalists inside Belarus, but RFERL had a number of Russian speaking correspondents from its Russian networks who were in Belarus to report on what was happening there. So the Russian people knew what was going on in Belarus. They were expelled from the country early on. And so the unfortunate thing, just to close, as I've been gone during this crisis, it happened shortly after I was fired, is this is the moment where resources should be surged from USAGM, additional support provided to the networks, which is exactly, by the way, what the Kremlin did for Belarusian state TV, surging in anchors, technical assistance to make sure that Lukashenko's propaganda network stayed on the air. We need a similar surge of support for independent media, including Radio Svoboda. I think they're doing their best under difficult circumstances, but USAGM could be doing much more, from my understanding.
The gentleman's time has expired. We go to Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your service. I just think it's important in the beginning to stress the bipartisan support this committee has shown for this agency. You can look back at the time when the Republican majority was in charge, as well as today when the Democratic majority is in charge. And it's been consistent and strong and bipartisan. And that same bipartisanship has come through with the amendment I offered with the National Defense Authorization Act, with the chair and the ranking member joining me to work with the agency to depoliticize and to strengthen the oversight function and to prevent changes in the firewall within the agency. So it's a strong bipartisan history here that's been deviated by the actions of Mr. Pack and the administration. And Mr. Pack's received most of the attention here this morning, and rightfully so. He just violated a subpoena in an arrogant manner, a lawful subpoena. And you're struck with the irony here that the CEO, who defies the rule of law here at home, is in charge of an agency that's missioned with promoting the tenet of democracy, of rule of law globally. But, I want to get to the bottom of this because he deserves his criticism here, certainly, and more so. But he wasn't put there alone. He wasn't given the power to be there by himself. And he wouldn't continue to act like this without support from the administration. And I noticed in the testimony this morning, there's reference to things like, for instance, the heart of the attack of the Trump administration. So I want to ask our witnesses to give a little more testimony to what these attacks have been, so I can get a better understanding. This is just not one person acting alone. Witnesses have mentioned this kind of action, these kind of attacks on the agency. Could you explore what they are for everyone that's listening?
I can
probably
add,
Mr. Fly.
I can probably add one item which I think is relevant, and it has to do with the J-1 visa holders that, we were told by an individual who is, in Mr. Pack's, team that, it was largely to be in alignment with the White House's immigration policies, rather than connected to the needs of the agency and really the damage that could be done to a lot of our services if these critical skill sets went away. So I think, there's an example of one instance where, there's, I think, this connection.
It wasn't about the mission of the agency. It was about other broader White House policy that had been referenced. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Like immigration?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on these kind of attacks? Because we don't want to put this morning's focus just on the fact that there's a person in place. They're there for a reason. They're doing things for a reason.
Congressman, I just add, I think I referenced Trump administration attacks, although I might let Amanda speak more about that. But what I was referencing was the president's own direct attacks on Voice of America, which obviously led up to the confirmation of Michael Pack. Obviously, I was running RFERL, which was not directly attacked by the president, but it still was an attack on the agency and ultimately on the credibility of our journalists. The one final thing I'll just say, look, I'm a lifelong Republican. I don't believe that Mr. Pack's agenda is a coordinated strategy that encompasses the entire administration. As I testified, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was on the USAGM board, and including our corporate boards, until Michael Pack dismissed him the same night he removed the network heads. Secretary of State Pompeo or his representatives fully supported the reform agenda that many of us were pushing at the network.
Then if I could, because our time is very short, then it must be someone above Mr. Pompeo that's bolstering him, which leads us to whether it's Mr. Miller because of immigration or the president himself. And you referenced the president's own remarks. So I understand the distinction between the support perhaps of the Secretary of State, but he's not calling the shots here. And we know what it isn't. We heard from one of our colleagues, it was lack of security, Zoom, even though you don't use Zoom. It was hard drives, even though you use the cloud, you don't use hard drives. It was concerns about security, even though there's more egregious breaches of security right in the White House with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, and the president himself using an unsecured phone. So we know what it's not. But I want to quickly go to the greater concern, too. Ambassador Crocker, who I respect enormously and have had occasion to deal with him in other capacities, mentioned the threat to national security. Can you take a few minutes at the end of this to comment on the threat of really undercutting this agency to our nation's security? Ambassador Crocker, if you were still there, or anyone, jump in.
I am here, sir. The logic that lay behind the founding of VOA in the darker days of World War II was on national security, very directly, very clearly. And that's why I referenced that initial broadcast. In just a few words, Mr. Hale, I think, summarized the strategic logic of the creation of VOA and its continuing mission today, along with the other entities and grantees. It is an ugly world out there, as you know, sir. You've visited.
Well, thank you. If I could, you're breaking up. My time is running out, but I'd say it's so relevant today in that regard. It was just days ago that I was on a broadcast and a briefing with Svetlana Signokskia from Lithuania, and she was commenting on the importance when we were talking about what the U.S. can do of the kind of functions you're talking about, and your agency truly represents, not what they're being threatened to be turned into by this administration and Mr. Pack. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond since my name was mentioned? This is Amanda Bennett. I'd like to thank the Congressman for his question and just reiterate that, yes, as Mr. Fly noted, I was the subject of some, or my agency was the subject of some attacks. But I would just like to say that for me, the issue that raises the issue of the strength of the firewall. I don't know of any administration that is happy with the coverage that the media gives of them. ever in the history of administrations. And so the fact that the president might have something to complain about or to be unhappy about with the coverage is nothing new. But the ability to then have anyone reach in and alter that coverage is the real problem here. Everyone should be free to have their own opinions, but VOA and the other agencies, the other entities within the USAGM agency have been traditionally completely independent of such scrutiny and actions. And that is what I think is important for us to focus on.
And that is why I put in my amendment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for conducting this hearing, and thank the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for his really thoughtful remarks as well. Thank you to our witnesses for your extraordinary courage. And this is a deeply disturbing set of events that is happening at USAGM. And, you know, the power of the truth and the ability to ensure that trustworthy, reliable news is provided is essential, obviously, to freedom and democracy here and around the world. And the idea that an agency which has done this such important work for so long is now under attack by this administration, sadly, is just one more example of breaking important norms. So, Mr. Turner, I want to start with you. You said that it was clear to you after several weeks that Mr. Pak didn't come to the agency to run it. I'm wondering if it was clear to you what he came to the agency to do.
I still haven't settled on that because, no real strategy has emerged. He removed all of the network heads and he had a rather long confirmation process. So if he had people in mind to replace them, I would think he would have, advanced those, those individuals. I don't think he came to run it because to me, it doesn't feel like he's engaged in it. He hasn't wanted to fund parts of it. It's been about starving the organization of resources, whether it's, people, money.
Yeah. So, Mr. Turner, I guess that's my question. When you don't fill positions and you remove people from positions and you starve grantees, you don't run the agency, you actually stop it from doing its work, which it seems like was at least the result of his conduct. Ms. Bennett, I want to ask you, you spoke very powerfully about the importance of the firewall. And I wonder if you would describe what the consequences are when you have these serious violations of the firewall repeatedly, what that does to the confidence that people have of what's being reported and the morale of the news reporting agencies and impact on our efforts to strengthen the free press and democracy here and around the world.
Well, again, since I haven't been there during any period after my leadership ended, I can speak in general, however, in saying that, as I said in the beginning, the thing that distinguishes Voice of America, the thing that distinguishes American broadcasting from the propaganda efforts of the authoritarian regimes that we cover is the fact that we are known to be and are in practice separate from any administration, this administration or any administration. Any kind of attempts to regulate the output of the media by any administration would be unwelcome and would be damaging to the reputation of the journalists and the journalism. And so if you want to look at the single thing that separates us from propaganda, it is that independence, the ability to report things without a reference to whoever's in power.
Thank you. Ambassador Kornbluh, you spoke about the impact of the sort of ending or preventing funding to OTF as a result of Mr. Peck's direction. Can you speak about what were the implications on the work? And more broadly, what is the consequence of the kind of intervention that this administration has attempted to impose on the operations, the breaking of the firewall, in terms of the mission of the agency and frankly, who benefits from this conduct that diminishes the American voice around the world?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on technology issues. So I know that you know the importance of this internet freedom work. You know, I could go through the specific implications in Hong Kong, where OTF has a long history of supporting internet freedom efforts and was poised to expand its efforts in Hong Kong. But it was going to surge support for circumvention tools and expand support for digital training. And then USAGM froze and continues to withhold its funding, and did that just weeks before the new security laws came into effect. So OTF hasn't been able to support any of these efforts. I talked about Belarus, Iran. We have a similar heartbreaking story, and so on and so on. And so I think, you know, there are agreed upon U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities, which OTF, this tiny organization, this bipartisan success story, has furthered, you know, behind the scenes in its quiet, powerful way, working with civil society groups, technologists, and so on around the world. And now it's weakened. Not only does it not have the funding to do that, but there have been attacks on it, on its reputation, on its security that are just unfounded, that really, you know, will weaken its reputation into the future, even if the funding is restored. So to your question about who does it help and who does it harm, it harms us. It harms the United States. It harms people who support democracy and democratic values around the world. And unfortunately, it strengthens authoritarians.
Thank you so much. You know, Mr. Pak's conduct is a gift to our adversaries. It's shocking. And when you think about the strategic national security and geopolitical consequences of the undermining of the important work of these agencies, and then the cowardly failure of Mr. Pak to come and defend his just horrific behavior, undermining the core responsibilities that he has, and to think that he's being paid by the taxpayers of this country and doesn't have the decency to comply with a lawful subpoena and answer for his conduct, to me says it all. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that I've been running around to 3 committee hearings today, so if I retread some ground that we've covered, please forgive me. But to justify his decision to revoke the visas of foreign journalists working with the VOA, Michael Pak claimed that they might be spies. He presented zero evidence to back up this claim, however. I find the use of the term spies extremely interesting. For decades, authoritarian states have used this exact term to discredit or target journalists working for USAGM grantees. And so I want to ask the panel, do you believe a U.S. official claiming VOA journalists or spies helps authoritarian governments discredit the work of USAGM's grantees? And I open that up to anyone on the panel.
I'll just jump in, Congressman. I think Mr. Pak's comments were primarily about VOA, but I'll just say, having run RFERL, it's incredibly demoralizing for the journalists of an entity like RFERL to hear the head of USAGM making such comments, especially given, as you noted, that these are the same slurs that are hurled at them by the Kremlin, by authoritarian regimes wherever they operate, and they're often accusations that are weaponized as they're pressured, or as I mentioned before, with our colleagues in Belarus, thrown into prison. And so it's incredibly dangerous for the USAGM head to start basically writing the press release that the Kremlin can then turn around and use the next week about USAGM journalists.
Thank you.
I can't say it any better than Jamie. That's exactly my same sentiment. To use that term against reporters, it creates incredible danger. It's so irresponsible, and it shows how little he knows about this agency.
And also the unceremonious dumping of journalists was quite bizarre, actually. The way that it was handled was very much what we would see in other countries with authoritarian rulers or nations that don't exactly follow the rule of law. But I want to ask you, you know, right now our country is facing a global information war from countries such as Russia and China and others. And our best defense from their disinformation campaigns is to provide objective, fact-based reporting so people around the world have access to truthful information. Outlets like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and the others are uniquely suited to be on the front lines of that battle. So how do the changes that Mr. Pack has made impact our ability to combat the misinformation campaigns of adversaries like Russia? And I would note that this includes inserting partisanship into USAGM and firing foreign journalists who have a better sense of how to appeal to target audiences abroad.
This is Ryan Crocker. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very briefly, the steps that have been taken and the rhetoric that has been used not only discredits USAGM as an objective source of news, a reputation that was very hard-earned and many have fought to maintain. It also endangers. I was a career field guy in some of the rougher parts of the world. To assert that spies of foreign intelligence agencies have infiltrated the establishment not only discredits reputation for honesty, it puts everyone out there in the field at danger. Words have consequences, and to make this unfounded assertion puts the very lives of our correspondents overseas in some very tough places. It puts them physically at risk.
No, and I have just a few seconds left, but I think that that's a very important point, that Mr. Pack, without evidence, has made libelous claims, really, that were these journalists to go get a job somewhere else in another country, could threaten not only their livelihoods, but their safety, when somebody from the United States government has labeled a journalist a spy. Who is going to go trust them in another country? Who is going to go hire them somewhere else? This man has acted incredibly recklessly, and even for that alone, he should be dismissed from his job.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Your time has expired. We now go to Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've enjoyed and learned a lot from listening to this hearing. I appreciate you holding it. Just to follow up on some of the themes that have already been mentioned, we've seen governments use a technicality in law to punish, imprison, or endanger journalists. We've seen governments accusing journalists of being spies as a way of curtailing them or having a chilling effect on journalists. Now we're seeing a general backsliding of democracy in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, and along with that comes kind of the predictable crackdown on journalists. Because of COVID, we know that the spread of misinformation is even more dangerous. So I wonder how your organizations are dealing with that new element and what Mr. Pack's actions have or how Mr. Pack's actions have had an effect on your ability to respond to this new threat.
This is Amanda Amanda Bennett, and I can answer the first half of that question. Perhaps someone else could answer the second half. I think it is demonstrable that in an era when there is just a flood of mis and disinformation, that the most powerful obstacle to that mis and disinformation is to flood the zone with accurate information. And one thing I found particularly heartwarming in my tenure as VOA director is we did a lot of interactive work with our audiences, and to listen to our audiences say that they came to us because they could believe that we said, that they could see what was happening in their own countries, and that we were the ones that they came to tell the truth about, particularly if you think about during the coronavirus. During the coronavirus, VOA in particular, and I know my colleagues at the other organizations did as well, very quickly spun up panels of global physicians to answer questions and give accurate information. Those were extremely well subscribed, and as was pointed out at the very beginning of this hearing, went viral in those countries, that information. Doing that kind of work is absolutely critical, particularly in this era of mis and disinformation.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in as well. Part of this information warfare that you alluded to is that we're in a battle with China, especially, and to some extent Russia and Iran and others, over whether there's going to be an internet with national governments able to censor and surveil, or whether there's going to be a U.S. model where there's open ability to access information. And OTF has been on the front lines of this. So I'll give you an example of some of the technology they were working on. OTF was incubating an AI-powered circumvention engine called Geneva that would have dynamically produced censorship evasion techniques faster than China's censorship apparatus could adjust. So get on the firewall and access the internet, access VOA information or RFA information, so on. And just a matter of months, the project produced over 60 viable means of circumvention, a process that would have previously taken years. That kind of innovation has now been put on hold because of these actions.
Let me ask you this too. We've got an administration that doesn't even believe our own scientists, so that should be a problem for you. But also a president who just enjoys attacking the press. He does it at rallies and at press conferences. He encourages people to beat up the press. He calls members of the press names. He demeans their work. And he started this international mantra about fake news. Was that part of Mr. Peck's agenda? And how does that affect your attempt to get out there real news? Anybody?
I can say that.
Oh, go ahead, Grant.
I'll just offer this really quickly. There's certainly, Mr. Pack has talked about, draining the swamp, and he has, just sort of that, that viewpoint, and he seems to think that the swamp extends to, to USAGM. So it gives you a little bit of an inkling of what he thinks about the place right now.
The only thing I wanted to say, based on my time on the broader board of the USAGM, is that part of what these entities do is they model what a free press is around the world. So they get good information into these repressive societies, but they also show what a free press is. And that's one of the values that the U.S. has shown around the world. What can a free press be? And I think you're hearing the importance of upholding that value and talking about the importance of the free press internationally and the kind of harm that can be done when we denigrate it.
Exactly. It's an institution that should be protected, not denigrated, as you said. You said that he wasn't there to run the agency. I think it's pretty clear he was there to run it in the ground. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the presenters. Mr. Fly, could you explain how Russia's foreign agent law has impacted Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and how had you worked to overcome any challenges brought about by this law?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. Russia's actions to try to tighten regulations around the media have had significant impact on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and our ability to reach a Russian audience. They passed this foreign agent law a number of years ago, which made RFVRL register as a foreign agent, basically having to say publicly that we represent foreign interests, which is not the case inside Russia, given that our journalists inside Russia are actually Russian citizens reporting on their own societies with full editorial independence, as we've discussed many times during this hearing. And they've now taken that to a new level of passing a law that allows the designation of individual journalists as foreign agents, basically labeling individual journalists as spies. And thankfully, they have not yet implemented that law, but it's hanging over the heads of our entire network of journalists inside Russia. And we have tried to do our best to continue to provide objective news and information to the Russian people. But this is one of those issues as well, where RFVRL would be looking to responsible leadership at USAGM to work with the State Department and with the US government and members of Congress to help RFERL be able to maintain that presence inside Russia. So this is going to be an ongoing problem, I fear, in the years to come.
And besides the foreign agent law, what would you say is the most serious and most pronounced effort by the Russians to try to cripple our efforts to promote democracy across Europe and the former Soviet Union?
Well, inside Russia itself, one of the biggest challenges I faced and was trying to move the organization forward was to just get access to the Russian audience. Over the years, the Russian government has slowly limited RFERL's ability to get content on the airwaves. It's stripped RFERL of radio licenses, it's blocked its 24/7 Russian language network from going on satellite packages. Really, the primary way that RFERL reaches the Russian audience right now is digital. And because of some of the internet issues that we've discussed earlier, the Russian government has even threatened to curtail that. So that was my biggest concern, where I was trying to move RFERL forward and just expanding our access. Some of that requires a broader conversation, I believe, between the US government and the Russian government about the way that Russian media, Russian state-funded and state-directed media are treated in the United States, because Russia Today and Sputnik don't face any of the limitations that I just described about reaching an American audience. They can access every American if they want to through multiple platforms. And right now, the Russian government has blocked RFERL and VOA from being able to do that.
And what do you think that credibility issues would be if broadcasters sort of like became perceived as propaganda outlets? You know, what is the impact, the overall impact in terms of credibility, the long-standing credibility, if this were to happen?
Well, for RFERL, I can't speak for the others, but it completely undermines the confidence of the audience. And if there are questions that, serious questions of credibility that are raised about RFERL's objectivity and independence, the audience will go elsewhere. It's an incredibly competitive media environment right now, especially through digital platforms. And even in some of these closed societies, they have other places to go to get news and information. Now, it won't always be independent or factual, but they will go elsewhere. And that's really what is at risk. And at least with RFERL and its services, what I saw is the connection between the audience and the network is incredibly personal. It's emotional. People trust the correspondents, they trust the anchors. And as soon as they think that those journalists are not able to do their job independently, they may be tempted to go elsewhere, which would really be sacrificing an important tool that has been developed over decades.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Espaillat. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Ms. Bennett, I just wanted to get a few facts on the table. Is it correct that VOA needs to maintain political independence and neutrality?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it correct that VOA is not supposed to target American audience with its programming?
That is also correct. Incidental acquisition of the content is permitted because it's very difficult, of course, to throttle the internet. But yes, targeting the United States audience is not permitted.
Thank you. Mr. Turner, before he was appointed as CEO of USAGM, the only thing most people knew about Mr. Michael Pack is that he used to make movies with Stephen Bannon. Mr. Bannon is a long critic of USAGM, admitting to the LA Times that he told the president long ago that Trump didn't need to start a new government network to push out the mega talking points. You got one, Mr. Bennett said, and he argued that it was called the Voice of America. Now, Mr. Bannon is long gone from government, thankfully, but the Trump administration remains intent on getting Mr. Pack installed so quickly before the election. And this is why I was so disturbed by a protected whistleblower disclosure that you submitted to the Office of the Inspector General. Do you recall that document?
Yes, Congresswoman, I do.
Okay. And in that disclosure, which details numerous abuses and potential illegal actions by Mr. Back and his team, two things really stood out to me. One is that you disclosed to the IG that Mr. Back required USAGM networks to carry out a link to editorial pages, to an editorial pages on each of those websites with a variety of press releases and other administration-produced information from the Department of UGS.
Correct.
First, why was that so disturbing to you that you needed to disclose it?
It gets at really the heart of the firewall and the independence of the organizations. Part of our mission is to help communicate and help people around the world to understand the policy positions of our government. What is the administration thinking about? What is the Congress thinking about? That's why we cover hearings. That's a big part of our job. Yeah. But dictating how the news is to be delivered breaches that firewall, ordering each of our networks to carry the administration's content in a prescribed way is a breach of that firewall, and that's why I wanted to disclose it.
And secondly, why was Mr. Pack so focused on using the organization to push out the administration's talking points?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it's the one maybe concrete thing that I've seen him do is insert these editorials into each of the networks. So I suspect it was on his list of things he wanted to do.
And the other thing that you disclosed was that Mr. Pack directed members of his team to participate in VOA's planning meetings for coverage of the upcoming elections. Why was that something you felt you needed to disclose?
Once again, just a horrible breach of the firewall. I think the last things that people in this committee would want is someone from the opposing party inserting their people into the planning meetings for the coverage of the upcoming presidential election. It runs one way this year, but eventually the shoe's on the other foot. And I think that's why when we operated under a bipartisan board, things were quite balanced. If you look at the body of work that our organization puts out, it's very balanced. So VOA said no to that request, and there are strong reporters there who have strong journalistic principles, and they resisted it. But do one by one take out the strong people and intimidate the others? That's, I think, a long-term question.
Well, we are thankful for that refusal. There is danger when VOA is seen as a propaganda arm of any administration. And as we do our work outside of the country, our credibility is important. And so I appreciate you for your bravery, and I appreciate every single person who's putting their life on the line in honestly reporting the news.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you, to our witnesses, for appearing in front of us today. So many of my colleagues, almost universally, have shared their mutual perspective of disappointment that Mr. Pack has chosen not to honor his commitment to testify in front of us. So we appreciate your time and, frankly, your courage. Jefferson once said that if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would not hesitate a moment to choose the latter. Our founders knew that a free press was vital to an open democratic society, and USAGM was founded on those very principles, and now its networks, of course, reach more than 350 million people all around the world. I couldn't say it better than its own mission statement. Quote, the 5 media organizations that comprise the USAGM complement and reinforce one another in a shared mission vital to U.S. national interests, to inform, to engage, and to connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. So it is clear to me that all of you, all of our witnesses here today adhere to those very values and are committed to the pursuit in support of this mission. And that's why I've watched with such alarm as Mr. Pack has compromised so many of these core elements. To name a few, attempting to withhold funding from and cripple programs of national security interest to the United States, making public comments about foregoing COVID protections for employees in an effort to, quote, drain the swamp, end quote, dismissing lawyers who advised him on the importance of the firewall that legally protects VOA's legally mandated editorial independence, among many other things. So my first question is to you, Mr. Crocker, about that role of political appointees, the role that they can and should play in the governance of USAGM. So please tell us, what is the specific role of the various boards of directors of the services?
Thank you, Congress, for that excellent question. The board of USAGM, and Ambassador Kornbluh and I were two of its members, that board was dissolved effective with the first presidentially nominated Senate-confirmed CEO, Michael Pack, as soon as he was sworn in. We expected that. That was in the legislation that the Hill. What we did not expect was the wholesale dismissal of the mirror boards for the entities and grantees. One of the important changes the board on which I was privileged to serve was to ensure that board membership across all of the entities and agencies was the same as the USAGM board. That gave us a common perspective. It gave us the opportunity to ensure coherent decision making. So the entity and grantee boards, and again identical to the broader USAGM board, was to oversee the functioning of the agencies, to ask the hard questions, and in particular to approve resource allocation. We were all prepared, I think, to carry on as necessary on those boards to assist with the process of transition. We were all thoroughly dismissed. So in addition to the problems we have seen since June, you quite correctly add to it that it is not simply that the CEOs are all dismissed. We have covered that at length here, a huge hit to our entire mission effort, but also the boards that had continuity and oversight. So effectively, as Mr. Fly and others have said, these ships no longer have rudders, and it is a very, very dangerous development.
Thank you, Mr. Crocker. You all know too well that Mr. Pack has replaced replaced members of the boards with himself, his chief of staff, Trump political appointees from other agencies, even the senior counsel of an organization that the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated an anti-LGBTQ hate group. So, Mr. Fly, a question for you quickly. What impact does that have on USAGM's employees, the culture, and the atmosphere inside?
It's incredibly dangerous, and I highlighted my written testimony, at least in the case of RFERL. The statute, despite the additional powers given to the CEO, specifically requires that the corporate board of RFERL make all personnel decisions related to officers. I have no evidence that the RFERL corporate board, the new corporate board that Mr. Pack appointed, ever even discussed my termination. I've never met any of the other board members other than Mr. Pack. So I don't know how they would follow their fiduciary obligations to the company under Delaware law where it's incorporated. And the final thing I'll just note, I have concerns about the fact that the board of each of the grantees is now a majority federal board. There's only one non-federal member on that board. The statute, and I have it right in front of me, says specifically that the statute is not to make any of the grantees a federal agency or instrumentality. I don't know how that is maintained when you have a corporate board of each of the grantees that is made up of a majority of federal officials. So I think there's a whole host of issues here that haven't been explored yet that should be explored, because I think they have significant long-term consequences for the independence of each of the grantees.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And thank you. I yield back. Thank you. Thank you all for your courage.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all here present and also virtually for your very, I think, brave testimony. I will also apologize in case this question has been asked and answered, but I would love to know first from Ms. Bennett if you could help us understand why there are so many journalists who are foreign nationals in Voice of America, and what particular skills do they bring to the work. And also if you would enlighten us a little bit more about the recruitment process for these journalists and what draws them to the work, sometimes, of course, risking their lives to do so.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The journalists that come here from other countries bring really unique skills that are very, very hard to find. And we know this because before we recruit anyone from the outside, we are required to advertise extensively within the United States looking for these skills. And over years and years, it has proved very difficult to find people with excellent journalistic skills, native and colloquial command of a language that can be used in a broadcasting platform. So, and also people with journalistic skills and contact and understanding of the countries in which they broadcast. These are unbelievably difficult things to find. The people that come to us, to the Voice of America to broadcast, see this as a career move because of the reputation that Voice of America has, both in their countries and around the world. So to be able to come and work at the Voice of America is both a tremendous honor and a tremendous risk and a tremendous undertaking, because as has been mentioned previously here, it is a security and safety risk for many of these people, because the countries we are broadcasting to and recruiting from are largely authoritarian countries that do not welcome the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe or Radio Free Asia broadcasting there. So the journalists that come here are both highly skilled, highly knowledgeable, and highly courageous, and perform a very vital function within the broadcast of all of us.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that insight. This next question is for you as well as for Mr. Fly, and I think that Mr. Phillips also asked a similar question, but I'd be interested to know what you are perceiving the morale of everybody to be underneath these very, very difficult circumstances. If you could comment on that, please. Let's start with Mr. Turner.
I do have contact with folks who've reached out to me, and it seems like it's pretty bad. It's sad. Mr. Pack said one of his goals was to raise morale, and it's completely the opposite. I mean, his actions have created a chilling effect. It's intimidating people. People are afraid for their jobs. People are afraid that they're going to have to leave the country, as you had pointed out, and go back to potentially really unwelcome receptions due to the work that they've done for us. So it's pretty bad.
Ms. Bennett, would you like to add to that?
I think I'd like to discuss it in the opposite effect, which is that during the time up until our departure, the leaders of the organizations, we found that our morale had increased substantially because of the dedication and devotion of the journalists to their mission. And so for those of us who felt like our mission was to remove obstacles and to clear the path for them to operate more effectively, we found that improved the morale. We at VOA actually surveyed the morale and discovered that between 2016 to the previous year, this current year, morale increased from 46% of people believing that they were generally satisfied with the organization to over 70%. That's a pretty big jump, and I attribute that completely to the dedication that people had to the mission and their appreciation of the fact that they felt that the mission was being supported.
Thanks. And with the last 30 or so seconds of my time, I was wondering, you clearly, I hope, have heard that there's an enormous amount of support bipartisanly for the mission of USAGM. And as we try as a Congress to continue our responsibility of oversight, what kind of reforms do you believe that could be made at the agency, and how could Congress be helpful in those reforms as well? I'll start with Mr. Turner, since he's in front of me and shaking his head.
As we kind of entered on this experiment of having our first presidentially appointed Senate confirmed, CEO, we didn't quite know what to expect, and I think everyone thought, kind of a reasonable person theory that you get a reasonable people, the governance structure that was created would work. It certainly doesn't feel like it's working very well right now. I think there are a lot of people, with ideas about, what, reform could take place. I mentioned our former general counsel, David Kligerman, who's very knowledgeable and I know would be very happy to, to assist anyone. There's a thing about, don't tear down a fence until you know why someone put it up, and I think that's the case here. We had a bipartisan board, and it worked. So maybe going back to that might help.
Thank you. I apologize for going over, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start with a question that I think will help illuminate the value of these broadcast agencies. We've talked about Belarus quite a bit as a current example. And I just wanted to ask Mr. Fly to confirm that RFE and Radio Svoboda, they're covering this crisis every single day, basically 24/7. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, and often, as I noted before, getting arrested while doing it.
Right. And CNN isn't broadcasting 24/7 from Belarus. Fox News isn't. The Times isn't doing 12 stories a day on its front page, or any other major newspaper, right? So this is a unique service that the rest of the international media just does not have the resources to provide.
Yes, especially in Belarusian, which is what Svoboda is broadcasting in. There are several other private competitors, but obviously their primary competitor is Belarusian state TV. It's Lukashenko's propaganda, now buttressed by RT apparatchiks sent from Moscow.
Right, and just very briefly, like, what is the difference between our coverage and RT? Why do people in Belarus want to listen to our service?
Because over decades, they've built confidence amongst the audience and respect, because they know Svoboda stands for truth. And there have even been videos during the protests of them seeing the Svoboda journalists covering the protests and the crowd starting to chant, Svoboda, Svoboda. There's an emotional attachment to the brand.
Well, it's that notion of truth, and I'll tell you a sort of a personal experience. I was born in Poland, and my family once told me the story in the 1960s, Polish state television, communist television, which showed these images of our civil rights protests in the American South, thinking that it would turn people against America because there's violence, people protesting for their rights being put down by riot police. And it had exactly the opposite effect, because actually seeing the truth about Americans being able to protest injustice convinced people in Poland that actually, this is a system we'd like to have in our country. And so this notion of telling the truth, whether the news about America is good or bad, being valuable to our interest, I think, is central to this discussion. Mr. Turner, I'm sure you're aware that Mr. Pack has a long-standing association with Steve Bannon. And that before his appointment, Pack's appointment, Mr. Bannon was pushing this appointment as a way of trying to ensure that these broadcast agencies were promoting the President's America First agenda around the world, that it would compete with CNN, he said. is that appropriate? And B, after Mr. Pak's arrival, did you see any sign that that was in fact his motivation?
Thank you. It's certainly not appropriate. I think there have been windows into that. The firewall breaches with trying to insert political leadership or his operatives into planning sessions for VOA's coverage of a presidential election, I think is an indication of how they would like things to work. As of now, I think each of the grantees and VOA are showing what high quality reporting takes place there. They're excellent journalists and they're standing strong. I know that many of them have been asked to compromise, and there have been there's been lots of intimidation. I think the worry is, as Mr. Pak's tenure continues, do you remove the strongest of the strong? Do you wear down the others? Does the intimidation permeate the organizations? And it's the trajectory I really worry about.
Well, I would say if President Joe Biden were to appoint somebody to this position with the charge of competing with Fox News or promoting the Biden administration's vision of the world, I would be just as upset. It would be just as damaging to the integrity of this institution. And let me just say, we've heard a lot of paranoia coming from this man about foreign spies infiltrating U.S. AGM. And I would say, I would never accuse somebody of consciously serving foreign interests without evidence to back that charge. But if China, Russia, North Korea, or any of our adversaries had in fact infiltrated U.S. AGM, they could not possibly have done more harm to America's interests than Mr. Pak has in fact done on his own. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired, and that concludes the questioning. I want to thank our witnesses for very important testimony. I want to thank our members for being sticking here, and almost everybody on the committee asked a question. And this is certainly something that we are going to continue to pursue as time moves on. So thanks to everybody who participated, and the hearing is now adjourned.